Welcome to the Silent Empires, where every story unfolds in the dark, and every whisper carries the weight of something deeper. This is a place for quiet nights, slow storytelling, and the people who find comfort in voices that don't need to shout to be heard. No ads, no interruptions, just uninterrupted stories flowing through the silence. If this story became part of your night, take a moment to leave a like. And in the comments, tell me something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Somewhere out there, others are listening too, different cities, different lives, same quiet moment shared together. New York City, October 1928. Evening rush hour is beginning to thin, and the traffic noise along a quiet side street on Manhattan's Upper East Side settles into a steady hum. On the sidewalk near a modest apartment house, a man lies motionless. The few passers-by who stop are uncertain what they're looking at. There is no dramatic chase, no roaring getaway car, no police sirens yet, just the still form of a middle-aged immigrant in an overcoat, one more anonymous figure in a city of millions. When detectives arrive and lean in to see his face, the mood changes. The name spreads in low, urgent whispers from one officer to another. Salvatore D'Aquila. To most New Yorkers, it means nothing. To the men standing over the body, it means everything. For years, this quiet, little-known figure has been described in police reports as one of the most powerful criminal leaders in the United States, a man whose influence reached from Manhattan tenements to small towns back in Sicily. Now he lies at their feet. His life abruptly ended on a residential street, his final moments as unremarkable to the public as his long, hidden career. Later generations would come to know other names, Luciano, Costello, Gambino, as the archetypal American crime bosses. By comparison, D'Aquila would fade into the background, a shadow behind the better documented legends. But long before their rise, he helped shape the underground world they would inherit. To understand how an obscure Sicilian immigrant became one of the first great power brokers of organized crime in New York, we have to step back from that silent sidewalk in 1928 and return to the world that produced him. A world of rural poverty and political turmoil in the late 19th century Mediterranean, and a rapidly changing city across the Atlantic that offered new opportunity and new forms of danger. The historical record on Salvatore D'Aquila is surprisingly thin for someone who once ranked among the most feared underworld figures in the country. He did not court publicity, rarely appeared in newspaper columns, and left behind no memoirs. What we know of his early life comes from scattered official documents, a few police and immigration files, and later recollections by those who moved in similar circles. Even the basic details, like the precise day and village of his birth, are disputed or only approximately known. Yet from these fragments and the broader history of his time, we can trace the contours of the environment that shaped him. He was born around 1873 in the province of Palermo on the northwestern coast of Sicily. The island had recently been absorbed into the newly unified Kingdom of Italy, but the promises of unification, modern government, fair taxation, opportunity, had not reached most Sicilians. In the countryside around Palermo, large estates dominated the landscape. A small group of landowners and leaseholders controlled vast citrus groves, grain fields, and pastures, while the majority of the population lived as tenant farmers, day laborers, and shepherds, struggling to survive year to year. In this setting, the phenomenon that would later be called the Sicilian Mafia was already taking shape. It was not yet the international criminal network that would appear in 20th-century headlines, but rather a loose, localized system of power. Men who could offer protection from bandits, from rival factions, and sometimes from the state itself, inserted themselves between landowners and workers. They collected rents, controlled access to jobs, mediated disputes, and kept order, often through intimidation and selective violence. In return, they earned influence, income, and a reputation as men to be respected and feared. Growing up in the Palermo region in the 1870s and 1880s meant growing up in the shadow of this system. Whether or not a young Salvatore was personally involved with such groups in his earliest years remains undocumented, but the atmosphere around him was clear. Authority was not simply what came from distant officials in Rome, but also what emerged from local networks of loyalty and silence. Police files compiled decades later in the United States would describe him as a man of honor from Palermo, a phrase that, in the language of Sicilian law enforcement, typically signaled membership in a mafia-type society. If that description is accurate, then his path into organized criminal life likely began not in New York, but on his native island, shaped by customs and power structures that were already generations old. At the same time, Sicily in those years was being slowly emptied of its people. Heavy taxes, recurring crop failures, and the absence of meaningful reform drove hundreds of thousands from the countryside into the holds of steamships bound for the Americas. Between the 1880s and the early 20th century, Italians, many of them from the South and from Sicily, left for the United States in enormous numbers. The journey itself was grueling. Weeks in crowded steerage compartments, inadequate food, poor sanitation, the constant risk of disease. For many, it was a desperate gamble, a choice made when all other options seemed exhausted. By the turn of the century, this stream of migration had become a torrent, and someone like D'Aquila, born in the early 1870s, would have reached adulthood just as opportunities, both legitimate and criminal, in the New World were becoming a powerful lure. The exact date of his departure from Sicily is uncertain, but by 1906 he was recorded as living in New York. He was in his early 30s, old enough to have established relationships and perhaps a reputation back home, yet still young enough to build a new life abroad. When he stepped onto the dock in New York Harbor, he entered a city already transformed by Italian migration. On Manhattan's Lower East Side, in East Harlem, and in parts of Brooklyn, streets were filled with Italian voices, shop signs in Sicilian and Neapolitan dialects, and the scent of familiar foods. But behind these traces of home, the conditions were harsh. Tenement houses were overcrowded and poorly ventilated. Dangerous factory jobs and casual labor on the docks or in construction were often the only work available. Prejudice from native-born Americans was widespread. And the machinery of local government, police, courts, and social services was often indifferent or openly hostile to the needs of the new arrivals. In that environment, many immigrants sought security through the same mechanisms they had known in Sicily: family networks, village ties, and, for a minority, clandestine associations that could provide protection in exchange for obedience and payment. Extortion letters signed with hand-drawn daggers or black hands, generic threats that the American press would label Black Hand letters, circulated widely. Some were the work of isolated opportunists. Others were connected to more structured groups. It was in this world that Salvatore D'Aquila found his footing. By the first decade of the 20th century, law enforcement officials in New York were becoming increasingly aware of an Italian criminal organization centered in East Harlem and the adjacent parts of Manhattan and the Bronx. At its core stood figures like Giuseppe Morello, nicknamed the Clutch Hand, and his brother-in-law Ignazio Lupo, known in the press as Lupo the Wolf. Their group engaged in counterfeiting, extortion, and control of local businesses. They also maintained close ties to mafia elements in Sicily. Later research by historians and investigators would place D'Aquila within this circle, as an associate and subordinate of Morello. The available records do not show D'Aquila's name splashed across headlines in these years. He was not dragged in front of photographers or paraded as a notorious suspect in sensational trials. Instead, he appears in more understated ways, mentioned in police intelligence reports, identified in later testimony as a key figure who operated just behind the more notorious leaders. That relative obscurity was not accidental. Men like Morello and Lupo had drawn intense attention from the U.S. Secret Service and local detectives because of their involvement in counterfeiting federal currency. Watching what happened to them, ambitious but cautious figures had every incentive to keep their own names out of the newspapers. The structure of the group to which D'Aquila belonged resembled, in some respects, the traditional mafia organizations of Sicily. There were hierarchies of authority, initiation rituals, and distinct territorial areas of influence. Within this system, D'Aquila is believed to have held a position roughly equivalent to that of a captain, responsible for overseeing activities in certain neighborhoods, collecting proceeds, and ensuring that orders from above were carried out. For newly arrived immigrants in East Harlem or the Bronx, this could mean that the baker on the corner, the grocery store down the street, and the small construction crew repairing a building all operated under a quiet but firm expectation. A portion of their earnings would go to men like D'Aquila in exchange for protection. To many in the community, this protection was a bitter bargain. On the one hand, these organizations could sometimes intervene when police would not. A merchant harassed by local youths, a worker cheated of wages, or a family threatened by an abusive landlord might find that a quiet word from a known intermediary solved the problem far more quickly than any official complaint. On the other hand, failing to pay, questioning demands, or appealing openly to the authorities could bring retaliation. Reports collected by reformers and journalists at the time include accounts of shopkeepers who endured threats, beatings, or the destruction of property when they resisted. Direct evidence tying such incidents to D'Aquila personally is rare, but the system from which he profited depended on a climate of fear that extended well beyond any single individual. One of the few aspects of his personal life that surfaces in the public record during these early New York years is his use of legitimate-seeming business as cover. Like many in his position, he is reported to have had interests in ordinary trades, small stores, service businesses, that provided both income and a respectable front. This blending of lawful and unlawful activity was characteristic of the emerging American mafia. It allowed men like D'Aquila to move through the city without attracting unwanted attention and to explain their presence in various neighborhoods as simple business, not as oversight of criminal operations. Meanwhile, law enforcement pressure on his mentors and associates was steadily increasing. In 1909 and 1910, federal authorities mounted a concerted effort against Morello's counterfeiting ring. The Secret Service, then responsible for protecting the integrity of U.S. currency, infiltrated the organization and gathered extensive evidence. The resulting prosecution sent Morello, Lupo, and several of their key associates to prison for long terms. The newspapers of the day celebrated the crackdown as a decisive blow against what they described, often inaccurately and with considerable exaggeration, as a unified Black Hand society. For men like D'Aquila, the consequences were more complex. On the one hand, the removal of such prominent leaders created a power vacuum. Territories and revenue streams that had been tightly controlled now became contested. On the other hand, the intense scrutiny that accompanied the trials reminded everyone in their world of the risks of visibility. Anyone who stepped forward too boldly risked drawing the same attention that had brought down Morello and Lupo. It was in this transitional period, in the years just before and after 1910, that Salvatore D'Aquila began to emerge as something more than a subordinate. Police and later Underworld sources would depict him as one of the men who stepped into the space left by the imprisoned bosses, asserting his authority over parts of Manhattan and the Bronx and forging alliances with other Italian groups in Brooklyn and beyond. The details of this process, who he met, what agreements were struck in back rooms or over quiet dinners, went largely unrecorded, precisely because all involved were determined to avoid the mistakes of their predecessors. But the outcome is clear. Within a few years, D'Aquila would be recognized by both allies and adversaries as a central figure in the leadership of the Italian criminal underworld in New York. The path he had traveled to reach that point, born in the tense, hierarchical world of rural Sicily, shaped by the massive dislocation of migration, hardened by the brutal realities of immigrant life in New York, had prepared him well for a role that demanded caution, patience, and a deep understanding of how power moved in the shadows. Yet the same factors that had allowed him to rise would also ensure that his life and actions remained partially hidden from public view, his story preserved not in detailed biographies or boastful testimonies, but in the brief, matter-of-fact notations of police reports, immigration files, and the memories of those who survived the turbulent years in which he operated. By the early 1910s, with one generation of mafia leaders behind bars and new economic forces beginning to transform American cities, Salvatore D'Aquila stood at the threshold of a new era in organized crime. The choices he and his contemporaries would make in the following years, including how to respond to new laws, new rivalries, and new opportunities, would shape not only their own fortunes, but also the future structure of criminal power in the United States. In the years that followed the imprisonment of Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo, New York's Italian underworld did not collapse. It shifted. Old certainties dissolved, new alliances formed, and figures who had once stood in the background stepped quietly into leadership. Among them was Salvatore D'Aquila. He had no public coronation, no newspaper headlines announcing his rise. Instead, his ascent can be traced in subtler ways. The changing names in police intelligence reports, the whispered acknowledgments among other criminal figures, and the reoriented paths of money and influence across Manhattan and the Bronx. By 1912, investigators who followed such matters were increasingly encountering his name. In internal memoranda, both American and Italian officials began to refer to D'Aquila as a leading figure among Sicilian men of honor in New York. Where reports from the previous decade had centered on Morello and Lupo, newer documents described D'Aquila as a successor in East Harlem and the Bronx, controlling a network of associates engaged in extortion, gambling, and protection rackets. The phrasing varied: chief, leader, boss, but the implication was consistent. This was a man whose decisions could affect the livelihoods and safety of many in the Italian neighborhoods of the city. The world in which he now operated was not a lawless frontier. It was a densely populated urban environment in which rival groups, Sicilian, Neapolitan, Jewish, Irish, and others, shared the same streets and sometimes the same tenements. Control over a block or a trade could not be asserted simply by announcing it. It had to be enforced through a mix of reputation, strategic force, and negotiation. Men like D'Aquila learned to read the city's currents, which businesses might be receptive to protection offers, which local politicians could be approached through intermediaries, which police officers were more likely to look the other way in exchange for a quiet favor. As he consolidated his position, his organization adopted a structure that would in time become recognizable as the classic American mafia family. At the core was the boss, D'Aquila himself, supported by a close circle of trusted advisors. Below them were lieutenants who oversaw particular neighborhoods or lines of activity, and beneath those lieutenants were smaller crews that carried out the day-to-day tasks, collecting payments, running gambling dens, monitoring the arrival of new immigrants who might be recruited or exploited. The Bronx and East Harlem formed the heart of his domain. In East Harlem, narrow streets with Italian groceries, cafes, and social clubs offered a degree of cover. People gathered in back rooms to talk, to gamble, and to arrange business, some of it entirely lawful, some of it not. In the Bronx, newer housing developments and a growing Italian population provided fertile ground for expansion. Here, too, small businesses could be pressured to accept protection, and workers, from construction laborers to fruit sellers, could be drawn into networks of obligation and debt. For many residents, these networks were a source of fear. Contemporary reformers working in settlement houses and charitable organizations recorded testimonies from immigrants who described being approached by men asking for regular payments, hinting at consequences if they refused. There were reports of store windows broken after a shopkeeper resisted, of carts overturned, of unexplained fires. While these accounts seldom named specific perpetrators, they reveal the climate in which someone like D'Aquila held power, a mixture of overt threats and unspoken understanding that made it difficult for victims to seek help from the authorities. Part of what allowed him to maintain and extend this influence was his ability to remain personally distant from many of the acts that sustained his organization. When a business was pressured or a rival intimidated, it was rarely the boss who appeared at the door. Instead, it was a lesser figure, perhaps introduced as a friend or concerned neighbor, who communicated the message. This separation insulated D'Aquila from direct legal exposure and made it harder for law enforcement to build cases against him, even as they grew increasingly convinced of his central role. At the same time, he did not operate in a vacuum. Other Italian criminal figures in New York were pursuing their own interests, and conflicting ambitions regularly led to disputes. One of the most prominent figures in East Harlem during the early 1910s was Giasu Gallucci, a Neapolitan-born businessman and political broker often referred to in the press as the King of Little Italy. Gallucci controlled a profitable lottery racket and maintained strong ties to local politicians. His operations intersected with those of Sicilian groups, including those linked to D'Aquila. The result was a tense coexistence, punctuated by episodes of violence that drew the attention of newspapers and the police. Between 1912 and 1915, a series of killings in East Harlem targeted those close to Gallucci. Associates and bodyguards were ambushed. Attempts were made on Gallucci himself before he was eventually killed along with his son in 1915. The press eagerly speculated about underworld rivalries and Black Hand plots, but investigators struggled to produce courtroom-ready evidence. Various names, including those connected to Sicilian factions, appeared in police reports as possible suspects or instigators. D'Aquila's name surfaces in some later accounts as a beneficiary of Gallucci's fall, though direct documentation tying him to particular acts in this sequence is limited and inconclusive. What is clearer is that, with Gallucci removed, opportunities opened for Sicilian groups to extend their control over gambling and extortion in East Harlem. This period overlapped with another major episode in New York's Italian underworld, the conflict sometimes referred to as the Camorra War. The Neapolitan-based Camorra, rooted in traditions from the city of Naples, had established its own presence in Brooklyn and Manhattan. Led by figures such as Pellegrino Morano, some of these Camorra groups competed with Sicilian organizations for control of rackets, particularly in Brooklyn and on the docks. Between 1915 and 1917, disputes between certain Sicilian factions and the Brooklyn Camorra escalated into a series of killings that would eventually bring about one of the first significant criminal trials targeting Italian organized crime in the city. In this conflict, as in so many others, D'Aquila's hand is difficult to see directly, but his interests were clearly implicated. The weakening or removal of Neapolitan Camorra leadership would advantage Sicilian organizations, including his own. When a Camorra insider eventually agreed to testify in court, the revelations helped dismantle key Neapolitan networks in Brooklyn. Prosecutors secured convictions, and newspapers hailed the outcome as a victory against Black Hand terror. Yet while the Camorra's power was sharply reduced, many Sicilian leaders, better insulated, more cautious, and less directly connected to the exposed conspiracies, remained in place. In the reshaped landscape that followed, D'Aquila and other mafia bosses emerged with fewer serious rivals among Italian groups in New York. As his influence grew, outside observers began to speak of a new figure in the Italian underworld, the Capo dei Capi, the boss of bosses. The phrase would later take on a life of its own in popular culture, But in the 1910s, it reflected a more tentative attempt by police and journalists to describe patterns they only partially understood. Various informants and investigators suggested that the heads of different Sicilian families in the United States might acknowledge a single leading figure who mediated disputes and coordinated actions across territories. In several accounts from this period, Salvatore D'Aquila is named as holding that position. Whether his authority was as formal and absolute as the phrase "boss of bosses" implies is uncertain. The mafia of the early 20th century was not a rigidly centralized corporation, but a collection of semi-autonomous groups bound by shared traditions and mutual interests. A leader recognized as first among equals could exert considerable influence, especially in matters of arbitration and policy. But he still had to contend with other strong personalities and the practical limits of communication across different cities. What is clear is that by the mid-1910s, D'Aquila's stature among Sicilian criminal figures in New York was such that decisions in distant places could be affected by his opinion, and ambitious men often sought his approval. Simultaneously, New York itself was changing rapidly. The outbreak of the First World War in Europe in 1914 had immediate economic consequences for the city. While the United States did not enter the war until 1917, the conflict disrupted trade, created shortages, and altered labor markets. Many Italian immigrants had to decide whether to remain in America or return home to fight for Italy. Some did go back, others stayed, sending money to relatives and following events overseas with anxiety. The dislocation and uncertainty created both challenges and openings for underworld figures. On the one hand, military service and wartime industries absorbed many young men who might otherwise have been drawn into criminal activity. On the other, shortages and rationing created black market opportunities. Control over waterfront routes, warehouses, and supply chains became more valuable. Illegal gambling and loan sharking remained steady sources of income, as did protection rackets, which thrived in an atmosphere where official attention was focused on national security and the war effort. During this time, law enforcement attention to Italian organized crime waxed and waned. The spectacular Camorra trials had consumed considerable resources, and once they concluded, some of the urgency diminished. Investigators still kept files on suspected mafia leaders, including D'Aquila, but building strong cases against them remained difficult. Witnesses were reluctant to testify, not only out of fear, but also because of deep mistrust of the authorities, born from years of discrimination and indifference to the problems of immigrant communities. Nevertheless, glimpses of official concern appear in the surviving records. Immigration authorities monitored the movements of individuals suspected of criminal involvement, looking for grounds to exclude or deport them. Cooperation between American and Italian police increased, with information about suspected mafia members exchanged across the Atlantic. In some of this correspondence, D'Aquila's name appears on lists of men believed to be associated with mafia organizations in both countries. These documents portray him as part of a transnational network rather than a purely local boss, reinforcing the impression that his influence extended beyond New York. Within his own organization, the 1910s were a time of consolidation and quiet growth. As older leaders were imprisoned, killed, or forced into retirement, a new generation of Italian-American criminals began to emerge. Men who had grown up in New York rather than in Sicily or Naples, who spoke English comfortably and moved more easily between Italian neighborhoods and the wider city. Some of them would later become famous in their own right. As young men, they observed or interacted with older bosses like D'Aquila, learning both what to emulate and what to avoid. Among these younger figures were individuals such as Charles Lucky Luciano, who would later transform the structure of American organized crime, and Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, who would become one of D'Aquila's most significant rivals. In the 1910s, They were still subordinate players, working under established bosses, carrying out assignments, and testing the limits of their own ambition. The underworld culture they encountered was one shaped by men like D'Aquila, hierarchical, traditional, cautious, and deeply influenced by Sicilian codes of loyalty and silence. Outside the underworld, the decade drew to a close in a wave of turbulence. The United States' entry into the war in 1917 brought conscription, propaganda campaigns, and increased surveillance of enemy aliens. Although Italians, as citizens of an allied nation, did not face the same pressures as German immigrants. Wartime industrial expansion drew more people into factories and shipyards, changing the social composition of neighborhoods. In 1918 and 1919, the Spanish influenza pandemic swept through the city, hitting crowded tenements particularly hard, and causing enormous suffering among immigrant families. All of this had indirect effects on D'Aquila's world. Mortality among potential recruits and victims alike, disruptions in business patterns, and the emotional strain of war and disease all reshaped the context in which extortion, gambling, and protection operated. Yet the underlying structures of power remained. Even as new crises arose, small shopkeepers still had to weigh the risks of refusing payment. Gamblers still sought out unlicensed games, and those entangled in debts still turned to underworld lenders when legitimate options were closed to them. By the end of the 1910s, Salvatore D'Aquila stood as one of the most influential and least publicly known figures in New York's Italian underworld. He had navigated a complex decade without the spectacular prosecutions that had brought down some of his predecessors and rivals. To the average New Yorker reading the daily papers, his name, if it appeared at all, would have meant very little. But among those who tracked these matters, the detectives who maintained private files, the community members who spoke cautiously behind closed doors, the younger criminals looking upward, he was recognized as a central authority. A new and even more disruptive force was about to arrive, however, one that would radically increase both the profits and the dangers associated with organized crime: national prohibition. With the impending ban on the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages, the landscape in which D'Aquila operated was about to change more dramatically than at any time since his arrival in America. The quiet extortionist and gambling boss of the 1910s would soon have to decide how to respond to a new, immensely profitable, and highly contested illegal market. Decisions that would bring him into sharper conflict with other ambitious men and set the stage for the confrontations that would define the last years of his life. On a cold January day in 1920, New Yorkers watched something unprecedented unfold. Saloon doors were locked, barrels rolled out into the street, and police officers posed for photographers beside smashed bottles. The 18th Amendment had come into force, and with it the Volstead Act, banning the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages across the United States. On paper, it was a moral crusade, the culmination of decades of temperance activism. In practice, it instantly turned an everyday commodity into contraband and handed anyone willing to defy the law access to a vast new source of income. For a figure like Salvatore D'Aquila, the effect was profound. He had risen to prominence in a world of relatively modest rackets, protection payments from shopkeepers, shares in gambling operations, income from illicit lotteries, and quiet influence over local labor and markets. These activities could be lucrative, but they were bounded by the size of a neighborhood and the limited cash of working-class clients. Prohibition shattered those boundaries. Almost overnight, alcohol became the centerpiece of an underground economy that stretched from Canadian distilleries and Caribbean shipping routes to cellar stills in Brooklyn tenements and hidden bars in Midtown. Adapting to this new reality required more than simply deciding to sell liquor. Bootlegging was a complex enterprise. Someone had to arrange for the supply, whether by smuggling in quality spirits from abroad, diverting industrial alcohol into drinkable form, or producing cheap, sometimes dangerous substitutes in hidden stills. The alcohol then had to be transported, stored, and distributed to the countless speakeasies that sprang up behind unmarked doors and in back rooms. Each stage involved risk: hijacking by rival gangs, seizure by law enforcement, or exposure through careless associates. D'Aquila approached this opportunity in characteristically cautious fashion. He was no flamboyant entrepreneur eager to make headlines boasting of speakeasies and champagne. He was an older Sicilian boss, shaped by more traditional rackets and long-standing codes of restraint. Rather than personally overseeing barrooms or conspicuous night spots, he appears to have positioned himself at a remove, allowing others to handle the public-facing side of the trade while he focused on controlling routes, brokers, and wholesalers in territories where his influence was already well established. The Bronx and East Harlem, his base of operations, were well suited to this kind of role. The streets were crowded but intimately known to his associates. Side alleys, basements, and back buildings provided space for storage and small-scale distillation. Truck routes out of the city crossed through his orbit, and long-standing contacts along the waterfront and in rail yards could be used to divert shipments or ensure that certain loads passed uninspected. Neighborhood social clubs, ostensibly respectable gathering places for men from the same villages in Sicily, served as informal offices where agreements could be made and disputes settled away from public view. Prohibition also forced the underworld to renegotiate its internal boundaries. In the pre-1919 era, many rackets had been partitioned along fairly clear lines. One group might dominate certain gambling games, another particular markets or neighborhoods. Alcohol, by contrast, appealed to every segment of the urban population, rich and poor, native-born and immigrant. The profits were so great that existing understandings were quickly tested. Irish gangs with influence in municipal politics, Jewish criminals with ties to finance and shipping, and Italian organizations rooted in old-world secret societies all moved into the trade, sometimes in cooperation, sometimes in competition. Within the Italian sphere, the question of leadership took on renewed urgency. By many contemporary accounts, including police memoranda and later recollections from underworld figures, Salvatore D'Aquila was recognized in the early Prohibition years as a kind of paramount leader among Sicilian bosses in New York, a man whose judgment could be sought in disputes and whose approval carried weight well beyond his own family's territory. The term often used was capo dei capi, boss of bosses, though its meaning was more a reflection of influence and prestige than of any formally codified office. This elevated position did not mean his authority was uncontested. Other powerful Sicilian figures had their own followings and ambitions. Among them were the remnants of the old Morlo-Terranova group, the family that had once dominated East. Harlem before its leaders were imprisoned for counterfeiting, and newer figures who had risen during or after the Camorra conflict. One of the most important of these was Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, a Sicilian who had survived his own brushes with the law and violence, and now commanded loyalty from a growing number of gunmen and entrepreneurs in Lower Manhattan and East Harlem. The return of some older figures from prison complicated matters further. In 1920, federal authorities began paroling individuals linked to the earlier counterfeiting cases, including Ignazio Lupo and, somewhat later, Giuseppe Morello. Their release set off alarms in certain quarters of the underworld. Men who had once commanded unquestioned loyalty and whose reputations for ruthlessness were well established were now free to reassert themselves, at least in theory. For someone like D'Aquila, who had risen in part because these men were removed, their reappearance posed a potential threat. Contemporary law enforcement records and later historical studies suggest that D'Aquila moved to preempt that threat. Through his supporters and allies, He sought to limit the influence of the returning Morello faction, and to ensure that key positions within what had been the Morello-Terranova family were held by men loyal to him, or at least not hostile. One of the central figures in this maneuvering was Umberto Valenti, a young, ambitious Sicilian who would become notorious in police files as a feared gunman. Valenti, according to these sources, emerged as a leading figure within the old Morello sphere, but maintained close ties to D'Aquila, effectively serving as the older boss's representative inside a potentially rival family. The relationship was fraught from the beginning. Joe Masseria, whose influence was on the rise in Lower Manhattan, also had claims within the same orbit. He had long-standing personal ties to some members of the Morello group and saw himself, or was seen by others, as a natural successor to their leadership. As bootlegging profits soared in the early 1920s, overlapping claims to territory, loyalty, and income sharpened the lines between these men. What might once have been a manageable rivalry over gambling houses or neighborhood extortion now involved control over a commodity that poured money into the pockets of whoever could move it efficiently and safely. By 1921 and 1922, the tension had spilled into open violence. A series of shootings in East Harlem and nearby neighborhoods, typically described in newspapers as gang killings, marked the conflict between factions aligned with Masseria and those associated with Valenti, and by extension, with D'Aquila. One of the most consequential of these incidents was the killing of Vincenzo Terranova in May 1922. Terranova, a half-brother of Giuseppe Morello and a prominent figure in the old East Harlem Mafia, was gunned down on a Manhattan street. Police and contemporary observers widely suspected that the attack was orchestrated by Umberto Valenti's men as part of an effort to remove pro-Masseria elements and solidify control, though no convictions resulted. The death of Terranova weakened the remaining Morello faction and intensified the feud. For Masseria, it was both a personal and political blow, eliminating an ally and underlining the stakes of the struggle. For D'Aquila, it may have appeared as a sign that his strategy, using Valenti to reshape the leadership of a potentially rival organization, was succeeding. If Valenti could eliminate or marginalize those loyal to Masseria and Morello, then D'Aquila's influence over a broader swath of the Italian underworld in New York would be secured at a moment when Prohibition profits made such control especially valuable. Instead, the conflict escalated beyond anyone's comfortable control. In August 1922, gunmen attacked Joe Masseria as he dined at a Manhattan restaurant. Accounts in the press described a sudden burst of gunfire and customers scrambling for cover as shots shattered glass and sent plates crashing to the floor. Masseria, though targeted at close range, survived by diving for safety and escaping in the confusion. The attackers fled. Witnesses were reluctant to provide detailed descriptions, and those who were questioned often professed ignorance. To detectives familiar with underworld affairs, the message was clear. Someone with considerable resources and confidence had tried to eliminate one of the city's most prominent Italian bosses. Many contemporary observers, both within law enforcement and in the underworld itself, linked the attempted assassination to Umberto Valenti and through him to D'Aquila. There was no direct evidence tying the older boss to the attack, and his name did not appear in public accounts. But the pattern, Valenti's rise under D'Aquila's patronage, the earlier killing of Terranova, the ongoing territorial disputes, fed a widespread belief that the move against Masseria represented an effort by the existing Capo dei Capi to neutralize a dangerous rival before his influence became unmanageable. Whatever the intent, the attempt backfired. Instead of finishing Masseria, it hardened his resolve and rallied support around him. Within days, underworld intermediaries arranged what was described as a peace meeting, ostensibly to bring the conflict between Valenti and Masseria to an end. The gathering was set for a cafe in Manhattan, a familiar meeting place where both sides were expected to send representatives. In theory, such encounters, mediated by respected figures, allowed for agreements that could save face and prevent further bloodshed. On the appointed day, 11 August 1922, according to most later reconstructions, Umberto Valenti arrived in the area accompanied by a small entourage. What happened next is known only in outline. Shots rang out in the street. Valenti attempted to flee but was struck and collapsed on the pavement. Bystanders scattered. Police responding to the scene found him gravely wounded. He died shortly afterward. Rumors quickly spread that the shooting had been orchestrated by Masseria and his allies in retaliation for the earlier assassination attempt, with some accounts later naming a young Charles Luciano as one of the gunmen, though direct documentary proof of any individual's role remains debated among historians. For D'Aquila, the loss of Valenti was a serious strategic setback. His most assertive ally within the Morlo-Terranova orbit had been killed, Masseria had survived, and the perception of who held the upper hand in the Italian underworld shifted. In the months that followed, Masseria consolidated his position, gathering around him a cadre of loyalists and being widely recognized, at least informally, as the dominant figure in the old Morello family and increasingly as a contender for the role of Capo dei Capi. While D'Aquila remained powerful, his ability to dictate outcomes across family lines had clearly diminished. The power balance within New York's Italian criminal world thus entered a more fluid, uncertain phase. Rather than a single arbiter whose word carried unquestioned authority, there were now at least two major poles of influence. D'Aquila, still entrenched in the Bronx and East Harlem and commanding respect among older, more traditional elements, and Masseria, whose base in Lower Manhattan and East Harlem drew a younger, more aggressive cohort of associates. Other bosses, in Brooklyn and beyond the city, watched carefully, aligning themselves cautiously and seeking to avoid being pulled prematurely into what could become a wider conflict. Meanwhile, the broader environment continued to be defined by prohibition. Speakeasies multiplied, from basement bars in immigrant neighborhoods to stylish establishments attracting affluent patrons uptown. Newspapers, while occasionally decrying the violence associated with bootlegging, often treated the phenomenon with a kind of fascinated cynicism, publishing cartoons of secret doors and coded passwords, and reporting on raids with a mix of moral outrage and entertainment. Less attention was paid to the ordinary people whose lives were upended by the underworld's expansion. The shopkeepers pressured into storing contraband, the truck drivers coerced into making risky deliveries, the families who lost wage earners to arrests or underworld reprisals. In this turbulent environment, D'Aquila worked to stabilize and protect his core organization. He relied heavily on trusted lieutenants, delegating significant authority to men like Alfred Mineo and Francesco Frank Scalise, who oversaw operations in parts of Brooklyn and the Bronx. These figures, younger than D'Aquila but firmly rooted in the same Sicilian traditions, functioned as a bridge between the old-style mafia culture and the new Prohibition-era realities. They cultivated contacts with non-Italian bootleggers, managed relations with corrupt officials, and ensured that revenue flowed steadily back to the family's leadership. Law enforcement efforts against bootlegging were constant but uneven. Federal prohibition agents, local police, and occasionally even the Coast Guard conducted raids, seized shipments, and arrested drivers and bar owners. Yet the scale of the illegal trade, combined with widespread corruption and public ambivalence about the alcohol ban, made it difficult to mount sustained campaigns against the higher levels of the distribution networks. As had happened during the counterfeiting cases of the previous decade, the most visible prosecutions usually targeted those closest to the physical goods, not the men whose names appeared only in confidential intelligence files. As the early 1920s gave way to the middle of the decade, the outlines of a new underworld order came into sharper focus. The old, Locally oriented Italian criminal groups had evolved into more clearly defined families, each with its own leadership and territories, but connected through a web of alliances, rivalries, and shared practices. D'Aquila's family remained one of the most substantial, its roots deep in East Harlem and the Bronx, with important branches in Brooklyn. But it now had to coexist with other powerful families, whose leaders were less inclined to defer automatically to an older generation. For Salvatore D'Aquila himself, these years represented a complex mixture of success and erosion. He presided over a thriving organization in an era of unprecedented criminal profit, yet his wider authority as the acknowledged arbiter of Italian underworld affairs had been shaken by the rise of Masseria and the fallout from the Valenti affair. He remained a man rarely mentioned in the public press, but frequently cited in private law enforcement memoranda as a dangerous and influential figure. Within his circle, he was still treated with deference. Beyond it, ambitious younger men increasingly weighed whether association with him advanced or limited their own prospects. The city around him continued to change, its skyline climbing higher with each new skyscraper, its streets more crowded with automobiles and newcomers from across the country and the world. Prohibition remained the law, but cracks were beginning to show in its political and social foundations. Debates over enforcement, corruption, and the unintended consequences of the alcohol ban grew louder. In that uncertain atmosphere, the fragile equilibrium between competing underworld factions would not hold forever. When it finally broke, conflicts that had been brewing since the early Prohibition years would reach directly into D'Aquila's own life, reshaping not only his fate, but also the trajectory of organized crime in New York. By 1923, the new order of New York's underworld seemed, from a distance, almost settled. Salvatore D'Aquila remained entrenched in the Bronx and East Harlem, a reserved but still formidable presence whose name appeared regularly in confidential police notes. Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, hardened by his survival of assassination attempts and street battles, had become the dominant figure in Lower Manhattan, and had drawn many of the younger East Harlem gunmen into his orbit. Bootlegging profits flowed steadily, and the city's political and business elites were, in many cases, adapting to the reality that illegal alcohol was now as much a part of urban life as streetcars and skyscrapers. Beneath that surface stability, however, old rivalries remained unresolved. The killing of Umberto Valenti in 1922 had answered one question. Masseria had clearly won the immediate struggle for control of the old Morlo-Terranova territory, but it left another unanswered. How would D'Aquila respond to this shift in the balance of power? He was older than Masseria by at least a decade, a man whose authority derived from his role in earlier, less publicly visible eras of mafia organization. Many within the Sicilian criminal world still deferred to him as a senior figure, but fewer now regarded his judgment as beyond challenge. The relationship between the two men in the mid-1920s is difficult to reconstruct in detail. They did not give interviews or leave letters, and neither was ever put on public trial for conspiracy or racketeering in a way that might have forced their strategies into the record. What surviving law enforcement memoranda, later informant statements, and the pattern of events suggest is a grudging, unstable coexistence. Each man controlled a major family with its own hierarchy and revenue streams. Each had loyalists ready to act on his orders, and each understood that another open war, like the one that had just cost Valenti his life and thrown East Harlem into chaos, could attract dangerous attention from both the police and the press. In this delicate climate, intermediaries became crucial. Figures who commanded respect in more than one circle, older Sicilian men of honor with ties to multiple families, or businessmen who straddled the line between legality and the underworld, helped manage tensions. They relayed messages, arranged meetings in neutral locations, and floated proposals for dividing territory or profits in ways that could prevent overt conflict. Evidence of these efforts appears indirectly. Abrupt declines in reported shootings after particularly violent spells, rumors among detectives of peace talks, and the survival of men who seemed, from an outsider's perspective, to be heading for direct confrontation. For a time, these arrangements held. D'Aquila focused on consolidating his control in the Bronx and parts of Manhattan, while Masseria strengthened his base downtown. Each sought allies beyond the city. It was here that D'Aquila's longer experience and deeper connections in the older Sicilian diaspora gave him a temporary edge. From the late 19th century onward, Sicilians had settled in clusters across the northeastern United States, in Buffalo, in upstate towns, in New Jersey, in New England. Many of these communities had their own local mafia formations, often linked by kinship and village origin to groups back in Sicily. By the mid-1920s, several of these out-of-town bosses were recognized as important figures in their own right. In Buffalo, Stefano Magaddino, originally from Castellamare del Golfo, had emerged as a central player. In Brooklyn, Niccolo Schiro, also a Castellamers, headed a powerful family based in Williamsburg and Bushwick, with interests in bakeries, ice, coal, and other neighborhood trades. These men came from regions and traditions familiar to D'Aquila. He spoke their dialects, understood their codes, and by most accounts, treated them as peers rather than subordinates. Police and later historical accounts suggest that in this period, D'Aquila cultivated a loose alignment with Schiro's Brooklyn Castellamers and with sympathetic bosses in Buffalo and elsewhere. The relationship was not a formal coalition with written agreements or permanent councils. It was a network of mutual understanding, support in disputes, shared opposition to certain rivals, and respect for territorial lines. For the Castellamers, aligning with an established figure like D'Aquila offered protection against the growing assertiveness of Masseria's followers, who were increasingly willing to claim influence far from their original lower Manhattan base. At the same time, changes in American law and society were reshaping the environment in which all of these men operated. The Immigration Act of 1924 drastically reduced the number of newcomers allowed from Southern and Eastern Europe. For Sicilian and other Italian communities, this meant that the constant influx of new arrivals that had characterized the decades around 1900 slowed to a trickle. The balance within these neighborhoods shifted. Second-generation Italian Americans born in the United States constituted a larger share of the youth population. This demographic change had important consequences for the underworld. Older bosses like D'Aquila and Masseria were immigrants who had grown up in Sicily, steeped in rural power structures and clan loyalties. Many of the younger men around them had very different formative experiences. They attended American public schools, spoke English fluently, and were more familiar with New York's politics and cultures than with life in the Sicilian countryside. While they often remained deeply tied to family and ethnic networks, their ambitions and methods reflected a hybrid identity. To maintain his influence, D'Aquila had to adapt to this generational shift. He continued to rely on older lieutenants who shared his background, such as Al Mineo and Frank Scalise, but many of the lower-level operatives in their crews were American-born or had arrived as young children. They were used to seeing wealth flaunted in the form of automobiles, smart clothes, and nights out in Manhattan dance halls. The traditional mafia expectation that a boss remain in the shadows, rarely seen in public and living in outward modesty, competed with newer models of conspicuous success that some underworld figures, especially in other ethnic groups, embraced. Despite this, D'Aquila himself appears to have clung to a comparatively low-profile lifestyle. By the mid-1920s, he was living not in the cramped tenements of East Harlem, but in a more comfortable apartment in a respectable Manhattan neighborhood. He dressed well but conservatively. He did not preside over flashy nightclubs or grand public establishments bearing his name. When his presence did surface in official documents, it was typically as a quiet figure encountered in back rooms, social clubs, or private apartments, not as a fixture of the city's glittering nightlife. That caution extended to his dealings with law enforcement. Over the years, he was occasionally questioned, picked up in sweeps, or mentioned as a possible suspect in investigations, but he managed to avoid the kind of high-profile indictments and long prison sentences that had destroyed some of his predecessors. Part of this success lay in the structure of his operations. He delegated direct contact with illegal goods and with potential victims to subordinates, inserting layers between himself and any specific criminal act. Part lay in his disciplined adherence to the code of silence. Even under questioning, he offered little that could be used against him or others. The legal landscape of the mid-1920s added another layer of complexity. As public concern about the side effects of prohibition grew, especially the expansion of organized crime and widespread corruption, politicians called for stronger laws against racketeering and for more vigorous investigation of criminal conspiracies. Special grand juries were convened to look into municipal corruption and underworld influence in business. Reformers and journalists decried the system that allowed criminals to profit from extortion and intimidation, particularly in the construction trades, the produce markets, and the waterfront. In this environment, D'Aquila's family, like other Italian and non-Italian criminal groups, is believed to have diversified its interests beyond alcohol and traditional neighborhood shakedowns. Contemporary police and press reports from the Bronx and Manhattan describe patterns of coercion in industries where many workers and small contractors were Italian: building labor, trucking, coal and ice delivery, and the daily markets where fruits, vegetables, and fish were sold. While specific attributions are often murky, victims feared retaliation and frequently declined to identify their tormentors. Some intelligence reports linked certain rackets in these sectors to men known to be associated with D'Aquila's organization. The methods, as far as the record shows, followed a consistent pattern. A union local or a loosely organized group of workers would come under the influence of one or two dominant figures, often with reputations for toughness. Employers who wanted stable labor or avoidance of picket lines were encouraged to cooperate. Competitors who did not play along might find themselves beset by sudden labor disputes, vandalism, or bureaucratic obstacles. Fees collected in this way, sometimes disguised as dues or arbitration costs, moved upward through the hierarchy, enriching those at the top while obscuring their direct involvement. For ordinary people trying to earn a living in these environments, this system could be suffocating. An honest contractor might see his margins disappear in a maze of informal payments. A small merchant might discover that avoiding trouble meant constantly choosing between paying one group for protection and another group that claimed to protect him from the first. Social workers and clergy in Italian neighborhoods reported that some families lived in constant anxiety, not only about the risk of police raids on speakeasies, but also about the quieter, less visible pressures that surrounded every attempt to expand a business or move into a new trade. Yet despite this climate, the larger public remained only dimly aware of men like D'Aquila. When newspapers did address Italian organized crime, they often fell back on sensational language about black hand plots and vendettas, repeating familiar stereotypes without penetrating the structure of the organizations involved. Names like Joe the Boss Masseria, associated with spectacular shootings, appeared more often in print than the discreet Toto, whose influence extended across boroughs and into other states. To most New Yorkers, D'Aquila was either an unknown quantity or a vaguely remembered name from scattered crime stories. Within the underworld, however, his standing was not in doubt. Even those who gravitated toward Masseria as the more aggressive, opportunistic leader of the moment acknowledged that D'Aquila remained a major force, especially in dealings with out-of-town mafia families and with certain Brooklyn factions. Older mafiosi, particularly those who had known him from earlier decades, continued to regard him with a measure of respect owed to seniority and experience. When complex disputes arose over the division of bootlegging routes, responsibility for unsanctioned killings, or the handling of conflicts in smaller cities, his opinion still carried considerable weight. This authority, however, increasingly coexisted with whispers that he was out of step with the times. Younger men admired cunning, but they also measured leaders by tangible results: territory gained, money earned, enemies eliminated. In those terms, Maseria's recent trajectory, surviving dramatic attempts on his life, capturing control of the old Morello operations, and steadily expanding his reach, looked more impressive than D'Aquila's more measured stewardship of his traditional strongholds. Ambitious figures in the Bronx and Brooklyn had to decide whether aligning themselves with the older boss promised a more secure future than joining the rising coalitions around others. Beyond New York, too, change was in the air. In Chicago, the violent ascent of Al Capone and his organization captured headlines and popular imagination, reinforcing the image of Prohibition gangsters as brash, modern, and heedless of old-world restraint. Federal attention, while still limited, began increasingly to focus on high-profile bootleggers who openly flouted the law. In this new media environment, men like D'Aquila, who preferred to avoid the spotlight, seemed almost anachronistic. The danger, however, was that invisibility on the front pages did not guarantee safety in the streets. By 1927, the uneasy balance within New York's Italian underworld was fraying. Prohibition showed no immediate sign of repeal, and enforcement remained inconsistent, guaranteeing continued profits for those who could move liquor. At the same time, the sheer volume of money and the proliferation of rival groups made cooperation harder to sustain. Minor incidents, an unauthorized hijacking of a shipment, an insult at a meeting, a dispute over a debt, gained significance when they could be interpreted as testing the resolve of one boss or another. Rumors of plots and counterplots circulated quietly. Certain Brooklyn and Bronx figures were said, in later recollections, to be reconsidering their allegiances. Old grievances, dating back to the Valenti affair and even earlier conflicts, lingered beneath the surface. Several later accounts, pieced together by historians and law enforcement agents, would suggest that in these final years, the question of who truly held the role of capo dei capi, whether in name or in practice, was once again being contested, with some backing Maseria's claim and others looking to D'Aquila or to yet different leaders as potential arbiters. On the streets, life went on. Trucks rattled over cobblestones, crowds thronged the markets, and in back rooms across the boroughs men counted cash from card games and bar receipts. But for Salvatore D'Aquila, now in his mid-50s, the space in which he could move safely was narrowing. He still commanded loyalty from many. He still maintained his routines of quiet meetings and careful conversations, and he still believed, if the pattern of his decisions is any guide, that a combination of caution, alliances, and reputation could preserve his position. Events in the next year would test that belief more severely than at any point in his long career, exposing the limits of traditional power in a world transformed by prohibition and a new generation of ambitious rivals. By early 1928, the overlapping networks of loyalty and rivalry in New York's Italian underworld were under increasing strain. The city's illegal liquor trade had matured from a chaotic scramble into a more structured enterprise, with defined routes, regular customers, and established hierarchies. At the same time, the immense profits continued to tempt ambitious men to challenge existing arrangements. For Salvatore D'Aquila, now well into his 50s and 2 decades removed from his arrival in New York, this was a dangerous moment. He was still powerful, still respected by many as a senior figure in the mafia, but the balance of power around him was shifting in ways that were not in his favor. Giuseppe Joe the Boss, Masseria's rise was the most obvious sign of this change. In the years since the death of Umberto Valenti, Masseria had consolidated his hold on the old Morlo-Terranova operation in Lower Manhattan and East Harlem. Gunmen and organizers who once might have looked instinctively to older Palermo area bosses for guidance now measured their prospects by their proximity to Masseria's circle. His willingness to absorb risk, to survive assassination attempts, and to retaliate decisively when attacked had created a reputation for toughness that carried weight among younger gangsters, especially those who had come of age during Prohibition, rather than in the earlier era of counterfeiting and traditional extortion. Accounts from later underworld informants and law enforcement analysts suggest that this shift did not go unnoticed by D'Aquila. He remained head of a substantial family, with important lieutenants in the Bronx and Brooklyn and ties to mafia organizations in Buffalo and elsewhere. But he could see that his ability to act as a kind of overarching arbiter among New York's Sicilian bosses had been weakened. The position, often described as capo dei capi, never entirely formal but deeply rooted in custom and perception, was increasingly contested. Some bosses still treated D'Aquila as first among equals. Others, particularly those closer to Masseria, behaved as though the center of gravity in the underworld had moved. This ambiguity bred mistrust. In organizations where open elections and public charters were absent, power was measured in more intangible ways. Who was consulted before an important decision? Whose name was invoked to justify a move against a rival? Who was considered untouchable and who was thought vulnerable? In such a milieu, uncertainty about who truly sat above the other bosses could itself become a source of conflict. Rumors began to circulate that plans were being laid, by one side or the other, to resolve the question by force. Much of what is known about this period comes from reconstructions compiled years later, based on informant testimony and retrospective analysis by investigators. These sources, while valuable, are not always consistent in their details. Some describe a deliberate conspiracy by D'Aquila, allegedly in concert with sympathetic bosses outside New York, to remove Masseria before his influence became unmanageable. Others frame the dynamic differently, suggesting that it was Masseria and his allies who first contemplated eliminating the older boss to clear the way for their own unchallenged supremacy. What all of these accounts share is an understanding that, by 1928, each man regarded the other not merely as a rival, but as a potential existential threat. The broader context in which these plots were said to unfold was one of intensifying official scrutiny. While everyday enforcement of prohibition remained patchy and often compromised by corruption, there was a growing sense among reformers, journalists, and some public officials that organized crime, rather than individual saloon keepers or casual drinkers, represented the core problem of the era. Investigative committees probed police corruption. Civic organizations issued reports on racketeering in labor unions and wholesale markets. The term organized crime, still relatively new in public discourse, began appearing more often in newspapers and political speeches. For bosses like D'Aquila, whose wealth depended not only on bootlegging but also on steadier rackets in construction, trucking, and neighborhood extortion, this was an unwelcome development. The more that attention turned from the symbolic target of the speakeasy bar to the shadowy structures behind it, the more risk there was that long-standing, carefully built arrangements could be disrupted. Maintaining stability, avoiding public wars that produced headlines and grand jury hearings, was in theory in everyone's interest. Yet personal ambitions and old animosities made such restraint difficult to sustain. Within his own organization, D'Aquila relied heavily on experienced lieutenants who could bridge the gap between his cautious, old-world style and the more aggressive mood of the Prohibition era. Chief among these were Alfred Al, Mineo, and Frank Scalise. Both were younger than D'Aquila. Both had deep roots in Sicilian communities, and both had demonstrated an ability to manage profitable operations in Brooklyn and the Bronx without drawing excessive attention to themselves personally. To outside observers, they appeared as natural heirs within the family, men who could carry forward its interests in a changing environment. In Brooklyn, especially in the neighborhoods of Williamsburg and Bushwick, Mineo and Scalise's influence overlapped with that of Niccolo Schiro, the Castellammer's boss whose base was among immigrants from the town of Castellammer del Golfo. Schiro's organization, oriented around bakeries, ice and coal distribution, and other local trades, was less visibly flashy than some bootlegging outfits but nonetheless powerful. Schiro's connections to figures like Stefano Magaddino in Buffalo formed part of a broader Castellammer's network that had its own internal cohesion and traditions. Historical analyses suggest that during the mid-1920s, this network tended to lean toward cooperation with older, more conservative leaders like D'Aquila, rather than with the more freewheeling style associated with Masseria. This alignment mattered. If tensions between D'Aquila and Masseria boiled over into open conflict, the stance of out-of-town and Brooklyn bosses could tip the scales. A loose coalition of family heads who preferred the stability and traditions associated with D'Aquila might, in theory, resist any move by Masseria to impose his authority over them. Conversely, if they calculated that Masseria's star was rising and that opposing him would bring more trouble than benefit, they might choose neutrality or even quiet support for his camp. The uncertainty of their intentions contributed to an atmosphere in which every rumor of a meeting or a dispute was scrutinized for signs of which way the wind was blowing. Against this backdrop, D'Aquila's personal life remained largely obscure. Official documents from the period, census records, property listings, and occasional police reports indicate that he was living in a better appointed part of Manhattan, away from the crowded tenements that had housed earlier generations of Italian immigrants. Details about his family are sparse, but it appears he was not entirely alone. Like many men of his background and age, he is believed to have had close kin in the city, though they stayed out of the public eye. To neighbors who did not follow underworld gossip, he may have seemed like any other middle-aged immigrant of modest means who had done well enough to move uptown. His routines, as far as they can be reconstructed, were deliberately unremarkable. He visited doctors and barbers, frequented a small number of social clubs, and attended occasional gatherings in apartments and back rooms where business could be discussed discreetly. He did not travel in ostentatious convoys or flaunt large entourages. When detectives attempted surveillance, they often found that he blended into the urban crowd, one more man in a hat and overcoat among thousands. It was a style of operating that had helped him avoid the fate of more flamboyant figures in the past. But invisibility could not shield him from enemies who knew exactly who he was and where he moved. Through the late summer and early autumn of 1928, underworld tension in New York intensified. There were scattered shootings and unexplained disappearances within Italian circles, some reported briefly in the press, others noted only in police files. Later reconstructions by historians and former participants have suggested that, during these months, talk of a decisive move against one or another senior boss became more concrete. In some versions, D'Aquila was said to be exploring the possibility of using allied gunmen from outside New York to strike at Masseria's organization. In others, it was Masseria's side that was credited with planning a coordinated strike against multiple rivals. Whatever the precise sequence, the outcome is clear. On an October day in 1928, later documented as October 10, Salvatore D'Aquila was walking along a quiet street on Manhattan's East Side, not far from his residence. Reports from the time indicate that he had just left a nearby building, possibly after a routine appointment. The hour was late afternoon or early evening, when office workers were beginning to head home, and the streets were still busy enough to provide some anonymity. Somewhere nearby, men who had been watching and waiting saw their opportunity. The attack itself was swift. Contemporary newspaper articles, while restrained in their description, make it clear that he was shot in the street and died there before help could alter the outcome. Passers-by were jolted from their routines by the sudden violence, but as often happened in such cases, very few claimed to have seen details they were willing to share. When police arrived and identified the victim, the realization of who lay on the pavement transformed the scene from yet another city shooting into an event of considerable significance within law enforcement circles. Detectives familiar with Italian organized crime understood immediately that this was no random robbery, no quarrel gone wrong. A man of D'Aquila's stature was targeted only for reasons that touched the uppermost levels of underworld politics. Internal memoranda from the days and weeks following the killing show investigators scrambling to map connections, to interview known associates, and to cross-reference recent incidents that might have foreshadowed such an attack. Names like Masseria, Mineo, Scalise, and others appeared frequently in these confidential notes, but careful phrasing and the absence of hard evidence kept them from surfacing in public charges. Newspapers reported the murder with the mixture of sensation and confusion that often accompanied high-profile underworld deaths. Headlines emphasized his reputed status as a Black Hand chief, or mafia head, drawing on the language and stereotypes that had shaped coverage of Italian crime for decades. Articles described his quiet demeanor, his relatively modest lifestyle, and his long record of tangential brushes with the law without serious convictions. Some pieces speculated about a renewed gang war among Italian factions, though the specifics were often vague and colored by rumor. Within the Italian neighborhoods where his name carried weight, the reaction was more complex and more muted. Public expressions of sympathy were limited. Few wished to be seen openly honoring a man the police now described as a major criminal leader. Yet behind closed doors, in apartments and small businesses where trust allowed for more candid talk, people discussed what his death might mean. Some, weary of extortion and intimidation, may have hoped that the removal of an old boss would lessen their burdens. Others, aware of how such vacancies were usually filled, feared that the resulting power struggles would only bring further instability. His funeral, held quietly with limited public display, drew attention from both the press and law enforcement. Reporters watched to see which known figures from the underworld would attend, hopping to glean clues about allegiances and succession. Detectives noted license plates, faces, and whispered conversations. But if those present were aware of being watched, and they almost certainly were, they took care to reveal little. Attendance alone did not prove loyalty, and in a climate where the consequences of being linked too closely to any one faction could be fatal, many likely chose discretion over overt gestures of respect. In the immediate wake of the killing, the question that preoccupied both police and underworld observers was simple: who would succeed him? Within days, attention began to focus on Al Mineo. As one of D'Aquila's most trusted lieutenants and a man with strong bases in Brooklyn and the Bronx, Mineo was well positioned to assume control of the family. Subsequent investigations and later historical studies would affirm that he did indeed step into the role of boss, with Frank Scalise as a key subordinate. The family remained largely intact, its structures preserved even as its leadership changed. The more subtle and politically charged question was whether Mineo could or would maintain the same posture toward other bosses that D'Aquila had claimed. Here, the evidence points to a significant shift. In the months after D'Aquila's death, sources within law enforcement came to believe that Mineo had aligned himself, at least outwardly, with Joe Masseria. This did not necessarily mean personal devotion or full integration of their organizations, but it suggested a recognition of Masseria's elevated status in the new order. For a man who had just witnessed the assassination of his mentor, Prudence alone might have dictated avoiding open defiance of the man widely suspected, though never conclusively proven, to have been behind it. Historians and investigators looking back on this transition have often interpreted it as the moment when Masseria effectively assumed the mantle of Capo dei Capi. Without a senior rival of comparable stature to check him within New York, and with at least some previously independent bosses now seeking an accommodation with him, his influence reached what would likely have been its peak. Out-of-town bosses, including those in the Castellammers network, watched closely. Some accepted the new reality, at least formally. Others harbored reservations that would, in time, erupt into open conflict. For all the speculation surrounding the motives and perpetrators of his killing, the case of Salvatore D'Aquila's murder remained officially unsolved. No one was charged, and no court heard the full story of who ordered the hit or who carried it out. The silence that had protected him in life, maintained by associates who understood the cost of talking, continued after his death, now serving to shield those who had arranged his removal. In the absence of judicial findings, interpretations rested on patterns. Who gained, who shifted alliances, who moved into the spaces he had once occupied. From a broader historical perspective, his death marked the close of a particular chapter in the evolution of organized crime in New York. D'Aquila belonged to the generation that had bridged the old Sicilian mafia system and the emerging American underworld. He had risen in an era when activities like counterfeiting, neighborhood extortion, and control of small trades formed the core of mafia power. He had adapted, to some extent, to Prohibition, but his instincts and methods remained shaped by a more conservative, less flamboyant model of criminal leadership. The men who maneuvered in the vacuum created by his assassination, Masseria, Mineo, and the Castellammers bosses, poised uneasily on the margins, operated in a different environment. They were competing not only over traditional rackets, but also over a national black market in alcohol that connected New York to Chicago, Detroit, and beyond. They faced a press and a public increasingly fascinated by underworld figures, and law enforcement agencies that, while still fragmented, were paying more sustained attention to the structures behind street-level crimes. In that sense, the quiet street where D'Aquila fell in October 1928 was more than the scene of a single man's death. It was a symbol of transition, the point at which an older style of mafia leadership gave way, under pressure of internal rivalry and external change, to a new phase, one that would soon be defined by open war between coalitions, dramatic assassinations, and the eventual emergence of new systems of coordination within organized crime. The legacy of Salvatore D'Aquila would be carried forward not only by the men who inherited his family, but also by those who, having removed him, now had to contend with the forces his career had helped set in motion. In the months after Salvatore D'Aquila's murder, New York's Italian underworld did not pause to mourn. It adjusted. The transition in his own organization was swift and from the outside almost seamless. Alfred Al Mineo, his longtime lieutenant, emerged as the new head of the family. Frank Scalise, another trusted figure with deep Sicilian roots, became his principal deputy. To detectives who had tracked these men for years, there was no mystery about the succession. Internal memoranda simply crossed out one name and wrote in another. Where D'Aquila had once appeared as the leading figure in a given circle, Mineo now took his place. The outward continuity, however, concealed a fundamental change. Mineo was a generation younger than his predecessor and had come of age professionally in the Prohibition era. He shared many of D'Aquila's habits of caution and his preference for working through intermediaries, but his underworld worldview had been formed in a landscape where immense profits and rapid shifts of power were normal. He led not as a bridge between the old Sicilian countryside and the New York streets, but as a man fully embedded in the American city's criminal economy. Within the family itself, day-to-day operations went on much as before. Crews continued to collect protection money from businesses in the Bronx and Brooklyn, oversee bootlegging distribution, and enforce agreements in labor and market rackets. The names of some lower-level figures changed as arrests, deaths, and promotions reshaped the personnel, but the structure remained hierarchical and quietly disciplined. To most of the community members who had lived under D'Aquila's shadow, the pressures did not suddenly lift with his death. The same kinds of men came to the same doors with the same expectations. The real shift was in the family's external relationships. Under D'Aquila, the organization had often been described, by those inside and outside it, as part of an older, more conservative current in the mafia world, aligned with traditional bosses in Brooklyn and upstate. Mineo, faced with a new reality in which Giuseppe, Joe the boss, Masseria's influence was unmistakably ascendant, made a strategic calculation. Rather than challenge Masseria's emerging claim to overarching leadership, he moved into his orbit. In the months after 1928, figures once known primarily as D'Aquila men increasingly appeared, in police reports and later recollections, as members of the Masseria faction. This accommodation had immediate practical benefits. By acknowledging, at least formally, Masseria's senior role in the city, Mineo reduced the risk that his family would be singled out as an obstacle to the new order. He could preserve control over his core territories while participating in broader arrangements coordinated by Masseria, agreements over bootlegging routes, construction rackets, and responses to particularly troublesome law enforcement initiatives. For Mineo's rising generation of associates, alliance with the man many now regarded as Capo dei Capi also offered access to new opportunities and protection. But this realignment carried long-term costs that were not immediately apparent. In the network of mafia families stretching from Brooklyn to Buffalo, a different current of opinion was forming. Many of the Castellammer's bosses, men from the small Sicilian port town of Castellammer del Golfo and its environs, viewed Masseria's attempts to assert supremacy with deep suspicion. They preferred a looser arrangement among equals, in which no single boss could demand tribute or dictate policy to the others. Under D'Aquila, with his older style of leadership and his closer personal ties to Castellammer circles, this preference had, to some extent, been respected. Under Masseria, it increasingly was not. The man who would come to embody this resistance was Salvatore Maranzano. Originally from Castellammer del Golfo, Maranzano had arrived in the United States in the 1920s, part of a wave of Sicilians who came even as immigration restrictions were tightening. By the late 1920s, he had established himself as a central figure among the Castellammers in New York, effectively succeeding Niccolo Schira as their leading boss after Schira ran afoul of federal authorities and left the country. Maranzano brought with him a strong sense of Sicilian tradition and an ambition to reshape the mafia along lines he admired in classical and medieval history. He was said to have been fascinated by accounts of Roman legions and Caesar. From his base in Brooklyn and in close coordination with Castellammer's leaders in Buffalo and other cities, Maranzano resisted Masseria's attempts to impose tribute and control. Where Masseria saw his claim to overarching leadership as a logical extension of the old Capo dei Capi model that figures like D'Aquila had once represented, Maranzano and his allies saw it as overreach. They argued, within closed circles, that the mafia should function as a federation of families, not as a kingdom subject to a single monarch. For a time, these disagreements were handled through tense meetings, veiled threats, and minor skirmishes. But as the decade closed, the space for peaceful resolution disappeared. Later testimony from Underworld insiders, including the statements of Joseph Valachi in the early 1960s, would give this conflict a name: the Castellammers War. According to these accounts, by 1930, the disagreement between Masseria's coalition and the Castellammers under Maranzano had escalated into a full-scale struggle for supremacy, involving multiple families, dozens of killings, and shifting allegiances. Historians who have compared these later recollections with contemporary police records caution that the term war can give an impression of a neatly organized campaign that may oversimplify a more chaotic reality. Still, the pattern of events recorded at the time, an uptick in targeted murders of known underworld figures, increased surveillance of Italian social clubs, nervous reports by community members, supports the conclusion that the early 1930s were marked by an unusually high level of organized violence in this milieu. In that struggle, the family once headed by D'Aquila found itself firmly on one side. As part of the Masseria camp, Minio's organization was counted among the key supporters of the man aspiring to be the undisputed capo dei capi. Aligning with Masseria meant not only sharing in the benefits of his influence, but also sharing in the risks of being associated with him in the eyes of his enemies. For Maranzano and his Castellammer's allies, men like Minio were not neutral bystanders. They were pillars of the very order they sought to overturn. Law enforcement, meanwhile, watched events with a mix of alarm and frustration. Newspapers carried frequent stories about gang killings, often hinting at connections to larger underworld conflicts, but rarely able to provide clear explanations. Witnesses were reluctant to testify, and those who did often changed their stories or refused to appear in court. Detectives pieced together patterns as best they could: names of victims, their known associations, the locations of shootings, the types of weapons used. Internal charts mapped rivalries and alliances, with lines drawn between Masseria, Maranzano, Minio, and other bosses. Yet the deeper motives, the strategic calculations within these organizations, remained largely invisible. The war's causes, in their view, were often reduced to simple formulas: fights over territory, jealousy over bootlegging profits, vendettas imported from the old country. Such explanations, while not entirely wrong, did not fully capture how much the conflict was also a struggle over organizational culture and future direction. Masseria, for all his reliance on Sicilian networks, was open to working closely with non-Italian criminal groups, sharing operations with Jewish and Irish gangs where it suited his interests. Some younger Italians, especially those born or raised in America, found this pragmatism appealing. Maranzano and many of his Castellammer's allies favored a more ethnically closed, tradition-bound structure, with clearer separations and more emphasis on old-world codes. It is tempting, with hindsight, to imagine how Salvatore D'Aquila might have navigated this conflict had he lived longer. His record suggests a man who valued stability, who preferred quiet influence to public wars, and who was adept at maintaining working arrangements with multiple bosses without pushing his authority to breaking points. Yet the very factors that had enabled his style of leadership, an underworld still relatively small, profits modest enough to be divided without constant upheaval, and a fairly homogeneous core of Sicilian leaders, were disappearing even before his death. The Prohibition era's dynamism may well have made such careful balancing unsustainable. What is clear is that the vacancy his assassination created helped set the stage for the extremity of the Castellammer's conflict. Without a senior figure whose authority was broadly, if grudgingly, accepted across factions, disagreements that might once have been contained through arbitration spiraled outward. Masseria, lacking an elder counterpart of equal stature to check his ambitions, pressed his claims more aggressively. The Castellammers, seeing no trustworthy mediator, looked increasingly to armed resistance. The family, once guided by D'Aquila, now firmly in Masseria's column, became both a beneficiary of his temporary ascendancy and a target in the eyes of his opponents. The war soon touched them directly. On November 5, 1930, a carefully planned ambush in the Bronx claimed the lives of Al Minio and his underboss, Steve Ferrigno. They had gone, according to later reports, to a meeting near Pelham Parkway, possibly expecting a discussion of business or a resolution of some local matter. Instead, hidden gunmen opened fire, catching them in the open. The attack, widely attributed in contemporary police investigations and later histories to Castellamer's gunmen acting on Maranzano's orders, removed two of Maseria's key allies at a critical moment in the conflict. To those who had watched the slow evolution of the D'Aquila Mineo family over the previous 2 decades, the killing of its top 2 leaders in a single stroke was a striking illustration of how much the rules of the game had changed. In earlier years, bosses had certainly ordered killings and been killed, but such direct targeting of the very top of a family was less common. The assassinations of D'Aquila in 1928 and of Mineo 2 years later signaled that, in the new Prohibition-fueled Underworld, no position, however senior, could be assumed safe when the balance of power shifted. After Mineo's death, Frank Scalise stepped forward as head of the family. Once again, the internal structure proved resilient. Crews continued to operate, income continued to flow, and lower-level associates adapted to the new leadership. Scalise, like Mineo, initially remained aligned with Maseria, honoring the commitments that had placed the family in that camp. But the foundations of Maseria's position were crumbling. By early 1931, he faced mounting pressure from the Castellamers and growing doubts from some of his own younger lieutenants, who questioned whether his style of leadership could provide stability in the long run. Among those younger men was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, who had risen under Maseria's protection but who harbored his own ideas about how organized crime should be structured. Luciano's later statements and the pattern of events suggest that he became convinced that the old Capo dei Capi system, embodied in different ways by both Maseria and, earlier, by D'Aquila, was itself part of the problem. Concentrating so much symbolic authority in a single figure invited challenges and wars each time succession was in question. A different model, in which power was shared and disputes resolved through a council of bosses rather than a single supreme leader, seemed to him more sustainable. In April 1931, that tension came to a head. Joe Maseria was lured to a restaurant in Coney Island and shot to death while at lunch, a killing almost universally understood, then and now, to have been arranged by Luciano and carried out with the tacit support of Maranzano and other Castellamers leaders. With Maseria removed, Maranzano was free to claim victory in the Castellamers War and to assert his own authority over the reorganized mafia families of New York. For a brief time, Maranzano attempted to formalize a system he envisioned as more orderly and durable. He divided New York's Italian criminal organizations into 5 main families, each with its own boss, underboss, and hierarchy, and he placed himself above them as a kind of acknowledged superior. In this reorganization, the old D'Aquila Mineo Scalise family, its territory, personnel, and interests, was recognized as one of the principal units. Its later incarnation, under Vincent Mangano and, eventually, Carlo Gambino, would be known informally as the Mangano family and, in time, the Gambino family. The line of succession from D'Aquila through these later bosses is clear in both law enforcement charts and underworld recollections. Yet even Maranzano's attempt to impose a new version of the Capo dei Capi role proved short-lived. Within months of Maseria's death, Luciano and his allies turned against Maranzano as well, concerned that he was replicating the same pattern of over-centralization that had led to conflict in the first place. In September 1931, Maranzano was killed in his Manhattan office by men posing as law enforcement agents, an event that stunned both his supporters and his enemies. In the aftermath, Luciano and a group of like-minded bosses established a different structure, a commission in which the heads of the major families would meet to resolve disputes and coordinate policy, reducing the incentive for any one boss to seek formal supremacy. For the family that had once been led by Salvatore D'Aquila, these upheavals necessitated further adjustments. Leadership shifted again, with Vincent Mangano eventually recognized as boss and Frank Scalise taking on major roles beneath him. The family maintained its footholds in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and parts of Manhattan, continuing to profit from extortion, gambling, and other rackets while also expanding into new areas. Its internal culture, however, had to adapt to the emerging norms of the Commission era. Fewer unilateral moves that might provoke system-wide crises, more careful attention to interfamily diplomacy, and a renewed emphasis on avoiding the kind of high-visibility conflicts that had brought so much pressure in the early 1930s. Looking back from this vantage point, the arc of D'Aquila's life and posthumous influence becomes clearer. He had presided over one of the earliest recognizable American mafia families, guiding it through the relatively small-scale rackets of the pre-Prohibition years, the boom of the liquor trade, and the first experiments with a capo dei capi model in New York. His death signaled the fragility of that model in a rapidly changing environment. The wars that followed, culminating in the Castellamers conflict, illustrated why later leaders would seek to replace singular supremacy with a more collective form of governance. For historians and investigators, D'Aquila remains a somewhat elusive figure, a man central to the development of organized crime in New York, yet overshadowed in popular memory by the more flamboyant or more heavily documented careers of those who came after him. His story, reconstructed from fragmentary records and the echoes of later testimony, offers a window into the formative period when old-world mafia traditions collided with the explosive opportunities and pressures of early 20th-century America. The institutions that would dominate the underworld for decades, the Commission, the five-family structure, and the enduring power of the organization that would one day be called the Gambino family, were all shaped, directly or indirectly, by the paths he chose and by the conflicts that his rise and fall helped to set in motion. When the last reporters drifted away from the curb where Salvatore D'Aquila had fallen, his name did not disappear. It simply moved from headlines to files. On desks in police precincts and in the offices of prosecutors, papers were clipped together. Incident reports from the scene, earlier memoranda mentioning him as a suspected mafia leader, arrest records of his known associates. For a few weeks, detectives revisited old notes, looking for hints that might explain who had ordered such a deliberate public killing. They found patterns, but not proof. The people who knew the most said the least. Shopkeepers along the route he had walked told investigators that they had heard shots and seen a man lying in the street, but they could not, or would not, identify any attackers. Men known to have worked for him were questioned, but they professed ignorance, offering vague statements about having been elsewhere or knowing nothing about the circumstances of their boss's death. Within a relatively short time, the officers in charge of the case were forced to concede, at least privately, that the trail had gone cold. Officially, the murder of Salvatore D'Aquila remained unsolved. No one was charged, and in the absence of indictments there would be no courtroom record laying out, even partially, the behind-the-scenes story. In the language of law enforcement, his file remained open but inactive, a reminder of how limited the state's reach could be when confronted with networks built on silence and fear. Unofficially, among detectives who specialized in the Italian underworld, consensus formed quickly. They believed that the killing had been ordered by rival bosses, almost certainly those linked to Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, as part of a struggle over who would dominate New York's mafia families in the Prohibition era. As months turned into years, the practical focus of those detectives shifted away from the dead man and toward the living. Their notes reflected the new reality. Entries that once read D'Aquila Gang now spoke of Minio Scali's group, or simply folded his former organization into the broader category of Masseria adherents. The underworld, for its part, treated his death not as an end, but as a transition. Meetings were held to redistribute responsibilities, to reassure frightened associates that business would continue, and to signal to potential rivals that the family remained intact. To the general public, however, his name faded quickly. The late 1920s and early 1930s were years of economic upheaval. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 plunged the country into the Great Depression. Breadlines and unemployment replaced speakeasies as the dominant concerns in many neighborhoods. Crime stories remained a staple of tabloid coverage, but new incidents, new names, and new scandals crowded out older tales. By the time the full impact of the Depression was evident, the murder of a relatively obscure Sicilian boss in 1928 was, for most readers, a forgotten detail. Inside law enforcement agencies, the memory persisted in a different form. Analysts tasked with understanding organized crime began, in the early 1930s, to assemble the first rough chronologies of mafia activity in the United States. These efforts were imperfect and often shaped by stereotypes, but they were an attempt to see patterns across time, rather than simply reacting to each new case in isolation. In those internal documents, the names of Giuseppe Morello, Ignazio Lupo, and Salvatore D'Aquila appeared as markers of successive eras. The counterfeiting conspiracies of the early 1900s, the extortion rackets of the 1910s, and the Prohibition-era realignments that had culminated in D'Aquila's assassination. On the streets, those rough divisions were less distinct. Older mafiosi who had known D'Aquila personally carried their memories of him into the 1930s and 1940s, even as they adapted to new bosses and new structures. In back rooms and prisons, younger men listened to these recollections and absorbed them into their own understanding of underworld history. For them, figures like Toto were part of a lineage, not distant legends, but men whose decisions had shaped the environment into which they themselves had been recruited. The outside world, however, received only fragments of this story. Early academic and journalistic treatments of organized crime in America paid comparatively little attention to specific Italian bosses. In the 1930s and 1940s, books and articles tended to focus on broad themes: corruption, prohibition, vice, without delving deeply into the internal structures of the mafia. When names did appear, they were often those of more flamboyant or notorious contemporary figures. Chicago's Al Capone, New York's Dutch Schultz, and others whose cases had produced sensational trials. Meanwhile, within government, concern about organized crime waxed and waned. The end of Prohibition in 1933 removed the single most profitable racket of the previous decade and altered the landscape once again. Many of the smuggling and distribution networks built for alcohol were repurposed for other goods: illegal gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering. But the symbol that had galvanized earlier public concern was gone. Attention turned increasingly to the economic crisis, labor unrest, and eventually the approach of war in Europe and the Pacific. In this shifting context, the name D'Aquila remained largely confined to specialized files. In New York, some detectives in organized crime units, drawing on old intelligence, still used his name as a reference point when explaining the pedigree of what they now called the Mangano family, or more loosely, the old Mineo Scalise group. In Washington, as federal agencies expanded their reach, analysts in the nascent Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Narcotics began to compile their own lists of suspected mafia leaders, sometimes incorporating information from New York police and sometimes from Italian sources. Italian authorities, for their part, had kept their own watch on men like D'Aquila. Even after his death, records in Sicily and Rome reflected an ongoing interest in the diaspora of uomini d'onore, men of honor, who had left southern Italy for the United States and South America. Reports were exchanged through diplomatic channels, providing American officials with occasional glimpses into the pre-migration histories of figures they knew primarily from domestic investigations. In a few cases, Italian records explicitly identified D'Aquila as a member of a mafia casca. In the Palermo region, confirmation of what New York detectives had long suspected but could seldom prove in court. World War II brought a temporary, if partial, convergence of these interests. In the early 1940s, as fears of Axis sabotage and coastal vulnerability grew, elements of the U.S. Navy and intelligence services sought contacts in the Italian underworld who might assist with port security and potentially with intelligence gathering in Sicily. This effort, later known in outline as Operation Underworld, focused primarily on figures like Lucky Luciano and Joseph Socks Lanza. But in the process of mapping the networks through which such men operated, some investigators revisited earlier generations of leadership, including Morello and D'Aquila, to understand how the current structure had come into being. Still, public awareness of these connections remained minimal. The war years were dominated by news from overseas battlefields, rationing, and the shifting alliances of global politics. Stories about local gangsters, when they did appear, were framed more as curiosities or local problems than as elements of a nationwide system. It would take the post-war period and a new wave of political and media attention to bring the deeper history of the mafia, including the era of Salvatore D'Aquila, into broader view. That moment arrived in the early 1950s, with the Senate's Special Committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce, chaired by Tennessee Senator S. Kefauver. The Kefauver hearings, broadcast on the new medium of television, brought organized crime into American living rooms. Viewers watched as mayors, police chiefs, bookmakers, and suspected mobsters were questioned before glaring lights and microphones. The committee's focus was national. It examined gambling, racketeering, and corruption across multiple states. Yet as its staff dug into background material, they encountered the problem that had long haunted law enforcement: how to piece together a coherent picture of a criminal network that had evolved over decades and across borders. In the course of that research, earlier New York cases and personalities resurfaced. Staff investigators consulted with local detectives and combed through old reports. They encountered familiar names, Morello, Lupo, and less familiar ones including D'Aquila. Internal staff documents, some of which would only become available to scholars many years later, sketched out rough family trees of Italian criminal organizations, tracing lines from turn-of-the-century bosses to then current figures. In those diagrams, the family headed in 1950 by Vincent Mangano was linked back through Mineo and Scalise to Salvatore D'Aquila, Bronx and East Harlem boss, killed 1928. For the first time in an official federal context, his role was being recognized not just as an isolated criminal, but as a foundational figure in a lineage. The Kefauver Committee's public reports mention some of this history in broad strokes, emphasizing that organized crime had deep roots and was not merely a recent development. But the name D'Aquila did not become widely known. The public face of the hearings centered on contemporary rackets and on colorful witnesses who made good television. The work of reconstructing the past, while influential for policy and later investigations, remained largely invisible outside professional circles. The next major jolt came in 1957, when New York State Police raided a gathering of mafia bosses at a secluded residence in Appalachian, near Binghamton. Dozens of men from across the country, including Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Joe Prophesy, and other powerful figures, were detained as they fled across fields and through woods. The incident made national headlines and forced both the FBI and skeptical politicians to acknowledge the existence of an organized, interconnected mafia network. In the analytic scramble that followed Appalachian, agents and prosecutors sought to understand how the men arrested there fit into a deeper pattern. Genealogies of criminal organizations were drawn up with new urgency. Who reported to whom? Which families had historic ties? Where had the structures originated? For those reconstructing the background of Carlo Gambino, in particular, the trail led back through his evident alliance with Vincent Mangano to the earlier history of the so-called Mangano family, and from there, via Mineo and Scalise, to the organization once headed by D'Aquila. By the early 1960s, this emerging framework shaped one of the most famous episodes in the public exposure of the mafia, the testimony of Joseph Valachi, a low to mid-level soldier in what was then commonly called the Genovese family. Valachi agreed to cooperate with federal authorities after he killed a fellow inmate in 1962, believing, incorrectly, as it turned out, that the man had been sent to assassinate him. In 1963, he testified at length before Senator John McClellan's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, offering the first detailed insider account of the structure, rituals, and terminology of Cosa Nostra, as the American Mafia called itself. Valachi's memory reached back to the late 1920s, when he had first become involved in organized crime. In his descriptions of that world, he named names that had never before been publicly linked, with such authority to specific roles. Among them was Salvatore D'Aquila. Valachi identified him as a major boss in the Bronx and East Harlem, and crucially, as someone who had at one point been regarded as capo di tutti capi, the boss of bosses, before his murder in 1928. He described the rivalry between D'Aquila and later figures like Masseria in terms that echoed and helped to shape the historical narrative that law enforcement and journalists would adopt. Valachi was not a historian. He was a participant recalling events decades later. His testimony contained errors and contradictions. Yet in the absence of other detailed, contemporaneous accounts from within the mafia, his statements about figures like D'Aquila carried great weight. They provided a narrative spine, Morello and Lupo in the early years, D'Aquila as a successor, Masseria as a rising rival who triumphed after D'Aquila's death, and then the Castellammare War leading to the creation of the Commission. Subsequent investigations and academic work would refine, question, and sometimes correct pieces of this story, but the basic outline remained influential. In the years after Valachi, a growing body of literature began to fill in the gaps around these names. Journalists, drawing on informant reports, court records, and interviews, wrote broader histories of organized crime in America. Some, like Peter Maas in the Valachi Papers, brought the public inside Valachi's world, popularizing his accounts. Others sought to balance sensationalism with careful research, tracing the development of mafia families over time. In these works, Salvatore D'Aquila started to appear not merely as a name on a police chart, but as a key figure in the institutional evolution of what would later be called the Gambino family. Academic historians, approaching the topic with different methods and priorities, added another layer. In the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, scholars of Italian-American history and of crime began to examine the early decades of the mafia in greater depth, drawing on newly available archives in both the United States and Italy. They compared police reports, court transcripts, immigration records, and Italian carabinieri files, teasing out consistencies and discrepancies. In studies of New York's early mafia, D'Aquila was often placed between Giuseppe Morello and Joe Masseria in a chain of leadership, his career seen as emblematic of the shift from the counterfeiting and rural-style extortion of the old country to the more complex urban rackets of the American city. Yet even in this more detailed scholarship, he remained partly obscured. Unlike some later bosses, he left no interviews, no public displays of personality, no flamboyant trials that generated stenographic transcripts of his words. The evidence for his life is still mostly indirect. Mentions in intelligence reports, the recollections of contemporaries like Valachi, and the structural fact that a major, long-lived family within the American mafia traces its organizational lineage back to him. Historians have had to work carefully with these fragments, cautious not to fill in the blanks with too much supposition. What does emerge? Across these layers of law enforcement analysis, insider testimony, journalism, and scholarship, is a more textured picture than was available to those who first stood over his body on that Manhattan sidewalk in 1928. Salvatore D'Aquila appears as a man shaped by the Sicily of his youth and the immigrant New York of his adulthood, a cautious but ambitious organizer who rose quietly through the ranks, a boss whose authority, at its height, extended beyond his immediate neighborhood, and a figure whose removal marked a turning point that helped propel the mafia into a more openly violent and internally divided phase. By the closing decades of the 20th century, his name had settled into a particular place in organized crime history, not as a household word, but as a reference point familiar to specialists and serious readers. Books on the Gambino family typically began their genealogies with him. Studies of the Castellammare War treated his assassination as one of the precipitating events that cleared the way for Masseria's attempted dominance and the resistance that followed. In this sense, the long afterlife of his reputation, shaped by documents, interpretations, and debates, became as much a part of his story as the years he spent walking the streets of East Harlem and the Bronx. Understanding that afterlife is essential to understanding why a man who rarely appeared in print during his own lifetime now occupies a discernible, if still shadowed, position in the narrative of American organized crime. It shows how the gaps left by secrecy and silence have been filled, cautiously and sometimes imperfectly, by those trying to piece together how that world came to be, and how, in the process, the decisions and conflicts of one relatively obscure Sicilian immigrant came to be recognized as part of a larger historical pattern. Decades after Salvatore D'Aquila fell on that Manhattan sidewalk, the neighborhoods where he once walked had changed almost beyond recognition. The narrow, crowded blocks of East Harlem that had been packed with Sicilian and Neapolitan families in the early 20th century gradually emptied of their original residents. After the Second World War, many Italian-American families moved to the outer boroughs and then to the suburbs, helped along by the GI Bill, expanding job opportunities, and a desire to leave behind the poverty and stigma of the old tenements. New communities, Puerto Rican, African American, later Dominican and Mexican, made those streets their own. The physical traces of D'Aquila's world slowly disappeared. Social clubs closed or changed hands. The storefronts that had once housed Italian bakeries, barbershops, and groceries took on new names and new languages. Tenements were torn down or renovated. A passerby in the 1970s or 1980s might have walked along the very block where he had lived or met his associates and seen no obvious sign that it had ever been anything other than what it was in that moment. Yet the structures he had helped build endured, largely unseen. The family that traced its lineage back to him remained one of the most powerful in New York. Under Vincent Mangano in the 1940s and early 1950s, and later under Carlo Gambino, it maintained influence over waterfront unions, trucking routes, construction contracts, and gambling operations. Its leaders, mindful of the lessons of past publicity, cultivated a low-key style that in some respects echoed D'Aquila's own preference for discretion. They avoided flamboyance, kept their names out of the newspapers where possible, and relied on intermediaries to handle visible operations. Historically minded detectives sometimes pointed out this continuity to younger officers. In training rooms or over coffee, veteran investigators would sketch a rough family tree on scrap paper. Morello to D'Aquila, D'Aquila to Mineo and Scalise, then to Mangano and Gambino. The names of contemporary suspects, men under surveillance in Brooklyn or Staten Island, would be added at the end of the line. The point was to show that the people they followed in the 1960s or 1970s were not isolated figures, but inheritors of patterns that went back to the turn of the century. That sense of lineage also found its way, in more abstract form, into the work of historians. As academic interest in organized crime deepened, researchers used families like the one once headed by D'Aquila as case studies in institutional persistence. How an illegal enterprise, facing constant pressure from law enforcement and competition from rivals, could nonetheless maintain a recognizable identity across multiple generations. The fact that so much about its early leaders was uncertain, approximate birth dates, contested details of internal politics, unanswered questions about specific crimes, made the continuity all the more striking. Here was an organization that could outlast not only individual bosses, but also profound shifts in the economy, in immigration patterns, and in the legal environment. For Italian-American communities, however, the persistence of mafia structures posed a different kind of problem. From the late 19th century onward, many Italian immigrants had felt the sting of collective suspicion. Sensational newspaper stories about Black Hand, threats, and mafia societies fostered an association in the public mind between Italian identity and criminality. D'Aquila's own career had depended in part on that association. He thrived in an environment where the fear of retaliation and the expectation of mistrust from authorities made many victims reluctant to complain openly. By the mid-20th century, as Italian Americans became more integrated into American society, there was a growing determination among many to challenge and dismantle that stereotype. Civic organizations, cultural groups, and clergy emphasized the achievements of Italian American scientists, artists, business leaders, and public servants. When high-profile mafia cases dominated headlines, or when Hollywood turned to the subject, as it did with particular force in the 1970s, these groups spoke out against what they saw as the conflation of a small criminal minority with an entire ethnic heritage. In this dialogue between image and reality, the figure of Salvatore D'Aquila remained largely in the background. Films and novels that dramatized the rise of the mafia in America drew inspiration from figures like Charles Lucky, Luciano or Vito Genovese, and from fictional composites. The quieter, more opaque bosses of the earlier decades seldom appeared on screen. When directors did include characters from that period, they were usually archetypes rather than specific historical references. The complex web of relationships between men like Morello, D'Aquila, and Masseria was too intricate and too sparsely documented to fit easily into a 2-hour film. This absence from popular culture had a double effect. On the one hand, it spared D'Aquila the kind of dubious fame that later gangsters acquired. On the other, it left a gap in public understanding of how organized crime had developed. Without grappling with the less dramatic, more bureaucratic aspects of men like him, his methodical building of extortion networks, his cautious management of alliances, there was a tendency to see the mafia's structure as springing full formed in the Prohibition era. The era of early bosses became a kind of prehistory, acknowledged in outline but not deeply explored. When scholars and serious non-fiction writers did dig into that earlier period, they often used D'Aquila as a way to test competing theories about the mafia's nature. Some, emphasizing continuity with Sicily, saw him as evidence that the American mafia was essentially an extension of old-world cash, localized clans, with transplanted rituals and obligations. They pointed to Italian archival records describing him as a man of honor from the Palermo region, and to the similarities between Sicilian rural protection rackets and the urban protection he offered to New York shopkeepers. Others stressed the transforming effect of the American environment. They argued that, while men like D'Aquila may have come from mafia backgrounds, their organizations in New York quickly adapted to local conditions. A more ethnically diverse criminal marketplace, a more complex political system, and greater opportunities for profit beyond traditional activities. From this perspective, his life illustrated not just the persistence of Sicilian forms, but also their evolution into something distinctively American, a hybrid born of old customs and new opportunities. The question of political influence provided another angle. In some parts of southern Italy, mafia groups had historically functioned, in effect, as alternative power brokers, mediating between peasants and landlords or between local communities and distant governments. They might deliver votes for politicians in exchange for favors or protection. In New York, the picture was more fragmented. Italian neighborhoods were courted by Tammany Hall and by local machines that valued their votes, but the structure of city politics was crowded with other ethnic blocs and interest groups. Evidence from the period suggests that D'Aquila's organization, like other mafia families, maintained connections with certain ward heelers and minor officials. These relationships could help with practical problems, smoothing over a licensing issue for a friendly business, easing the conditions of bail for an arrested associate, discouraging too much scrutiny of particular buildings or gatherings. There is less indication that he or his lieutenants tried to dominate Italian-American politics in a grand, programmatic way. His influence was real but localized, focused on specific benefits rather than on ideological or broad political goals. For historians interested in the interplay between crime and politics, this distinction mattered. It suggested that early mafia bosses in New York tended to work within and around existing political structures rather than seeking to replace them. They were parasitic more than transformational, tapping into streams of money and patronage that already flowed through the city's wards and boroughs. In that sense, D'Aquila's story sheds light on how organized crime could become deeply embedded in urban life without ever fully controlling it. The difficulty always was evidence. Much of what can be said with confidence about D'Aquila rests on a small number of solid points: his origins in the Palermo region, his presence in New York by 1906, his association with the Morlo Lupo group, his emergence as a major boss in the Bronx and East Harlem, his likely recognition by contemporaries as a kind of capo dei capi, his rivalry with Joe Masseria, and his murder in 1928. Around those points cluster interpretations based on patterns: who succeeded him, who benefited from his removal, how his organization behaved before and after key events. Historians must constantly balance the temptation to fill in the gaps with plausible narratives against the discipline of sticking to what can be reasonably inferred. In the case of someone like D'Aquila, that discipline often means acknowledging the limits of our knowledge. We do not know precisely how he was initiated into the mafia, or exactly when. We do not know what he said in private to justify particular decisions or to calm the fears of wavering associates. We do not have his thoughts on the United States, on the immigrant experience, or on the morality of the life he led. We can only observe actions and outcomes, and, where possible, compare them with what is known about similar figures. That recognition of limits is itself part of his historical significance. It highlights how much of the early mafia operated in a realm designed to leave few written traces. Codes of silence were not just about avoiding prosecution. They were about preserving a particular kind of authority, one grounded in personal reputation rather than in formal records. For law enforcement, this posed perennial challenges. Unsolved cases like his killing were reminders that, for all the progress made in surveillance, forensic science, and undercover work, there were still events that the state could not fully penetrate. Over time, however, the dynamics began to shift. By the 1970s and 1980s, legal tools that had not existed in D'Aquila's day, most notably, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, gave prosecutors new ways to attack the kind of structures he had helped build. Instead of having to tie a boss directly to a single act of violence or extortion, they could argue that overseeing a pattern of criminal activity within an enterprise was itself grounds for conviction. Long-term investigations, wiretaps, and the cultivation of cooperating witnesses, successors, in a sense, to Valachi, produced detailed pictures of family hierarchies and decision-making processes. In these modern cases, the echoes of the past were audible. When prosecutors in the 1980s charged leaders of the Gambino, Genovese, and other families with running criminal enterprises. They often introduce charts tracing the history of those organizations. The Gambino chart, for example, typically began with references to its early leadership under figures like D'Aquila and Mineo, then moved through Mangano and Gambino to the defendants sitting in the courtroom. Jurors, seeing those lines, were being asked to view the accused not as isolated criminals, but as inheritors of a long, continuous system. In that sense, even in absentia, D'Aquila was present. His name, perhaps briefly explained by an expert witness or summarized in a judge's instructions, served as a reminder that what was on trial was not only the specific acts of the recent past, but also the durability of a structure that had outlived its founders. The very continuity that once gave such organizations their strength, allowing them to recover from the deaths or arrests of individual leaders, became a vulnerability when prosecutors could argue that the enterprise itself was criminal. Outside the courtroom, public perceptions of the mafia also shifted. The romanticized images of the 1970s films and novels encountered more critical portrayals in later decades, as journalists and memoirists emphasized the damage done to communities by extortion, drug trafficking, and violence. Stories from former associates and from victims' families painted a picture of life under mafia shadow that was far from glamorous. The constant pressure on small businesses, the fear of stepping out of line, the way ordinary social and economic life could be distorted by the presence of a hidden authority. Placed against that backdrop, the career of Salvatore D'Aquila appears in a different light than the archetypal gangster myth. He was not a swashbuckling outlaw or a tragic anti-hero. He was a disciplined organizer of a system that thrived on other people's vulnerability and silence. The fact that he conducted his affairs quietly, without public boasts or flamboyant displays, did not lessen the impact of his actions on the lives of those in his orbit. If anything, his caution made his influence more insidious, harder to see, harder to challenge, and harder to bring to account. At the same time, his story is inseparable from the broader story of mass migration, poverty, and adaptation that shaped the lives of millions of Italian immigrants. He moved through the same crowded tenements, the same harsh factories and unstable labor markets, the same experiences of discrimination and limited opportunity that so many others faced. Where many sought advancement through hard work, education, and political participation, he chose a different path, using the weaknesses of both the old and new systems to build an illicit power base. That duality, the shared background and divergent choices, makes his life a useful lens for examining how criminal structures emerge within marginalized communities. The conditions that produced D'Aquila were not unique to Italians in New York. Similar combinations of economic hardship, social exclusion, and weak law enforcement have fostered other forms of organized crime in other times and places. Understanding his trajectory helps to illuminate why some individuals and groups, in such contexts, turn toward such structures, even as others reject them. By the turn of the 21st century, interest in the early history of the mafia in America grew among both scholars and the public. Digitized archives made it easier to access old newspapers, court records, and immigration documents. Researchers could, for the first time, quickly search across decades of material for names like Salvatore D'Aquila and their variants, uncovering small but telling references that earlier generations of historians had missed. Italian archives, too, opened up in new ways, allowing for more systematic comparison between records on mafia suspects in Sicily and their later activities abroad. These efforts refined, but did not fundamentally overturn, the picture of D'Aquila that had emerged over the previous half-century. They confirmed his presence in particular neighborhoods at particular times, clarified some aspects of his associations, and occasionally corrected minor errors in earlier accounts. They also underscored how much of his world remains, and will likely remain, partly obscured. for a figure whose power depended on secrecy and informal authority. That partial obscurity is, perhaps, an unsurprising legacy. What remains, then, is a silhouette. A boy born in the turbulent countryside around Palermo in the 1870s. A young man arriving in New York as mass migration reshaped the city. An associate of early mafia leaders who rose, steadily and quietly, to command his own organization. A recognized arbiter among Sicilian bosses in the years before Prohibition. A rival to men like Joe Masseria as the stakes of underworld leadership rose. And finally, a middle-aged immigrant whose life ended on a city sidewalk in an unresolved killing that symbolized both the reach and the limits of the law in his time. In the following and final stretch of this story, the focus turns to what can be drawn from that silhouette. Not only about one man's trajectory, but about the society that produced him, the institutions that opposed him, and the long shadow his era cast over the history of crime and justice in the United States. On a clear afternoon in present-day Manhattan, the street where Salvatore D'Aquila died looks unremarkable. Cars edge past double-parked delivery trucks. People hurry along the sidewalk with phones in their hands and earbuds in their ears. Apartment buildings, some renovated, some showing their age, line the block. There is no plaque, no marker to indicate that, nearly a century ago, a man once described in police reports as one of the most powerful criminal figures in New York fell here under a sudden burst of gunfire. The city has layered new lives over old histories, as it always has. Standing there, it is difficult to imagine the world that shaped him. The boy from the countryside outside Palermo in the 1870s, born into a society where political unification had promised much and delivered little, where local power often flowed through informal networks of men of honor, rather than through distant officials. The young immigrant in early 20th century New York, stepping off a ship into neighborhoods crowded with fellow Italians, but scarred by poverty, prejudice, and the indifference of institutions. The quiet organizer in East Harlem and the Bronx, absorbing lessons from older bosses like Giuseppe Morello, building his own networks of extortion and protection in an environment where many victims felt they had nowhere else to turn. His story is not that of a lone mastermind inventing a system out of whole cloth. It is a story of someone moving along pathways that already existed, shaped by circumstances larger than himself. The failure of meaningful reform in post-unification, Sicily created conditions in which mafia organizations flourished as alternative centers of authority. The mass migration to the United States uprooted thousands from those contexts and transplanted both their survival strategies and their conflicts. The cramped tenements and casual discrimination of New York in the 1890s and 1900s gave clandestine groups space to operate, shielded by language barriers and a deep mistrust between immigrant communities and law enforcement. Within that environment, a man like D'Aquila could rise by offering and enforcing a certain kind of order. To merchants and workers in his neighborhoods, he represented both danger and, at times, protection. For some, paying him or his men was a painful but predictable cost of doing business. For others, especially those who tried to resist, he embodied the menace of an authority they could not vote out of office, could not sue in court, and could not safely denounce. The fact that he kept his name and face out of the newspapers for most of his career did not lessen his reach. It underscored how much his power depended on being known where it mattered and invisible where it did not. The limitations of early law enforcement responses to this world are a central part of his story. Police and federal agents in the first decades of the 20th century were often brave and persistent, but they were hampered by inadequate tools and, at times, by their own biases. Some dismissed complaints from Italian victims as just their way of settling things, or failed to distinguish between isolated acts of violence and the systematic pressure of organized extortion. Others, genuinely intent on stopping crime, found themselves thwarted by the unwillingness of witnesses to testify and by legal frameworks that focused on individual acts rather than on patterns of coordinated behavior. The American state's most consequential intervention into this underworld, Prohibition, came not as a carefully targeted law against organized crime, but as a moral and political project directed at alcohol. When the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act turned the liquor trade into contraband, they did not invent criminal networks. They supercharged ones that already existed. D'Aquila did not create prohibition, but he was among those who quickly recognized how the new reality could be used to expand influence and income. The bootlegging routes, storage depots, and distribution systems that sprang up in the early 1920s drew on existing skills: smuggling, corruption of officials, intimidation, honed in earlier, smaller-scale rackets. His trajectory through this period illustrates, in concentrated form, how policy choices can have unintended consequences. A law aimed at curbing one social ill ended up fueling another by providing unprecedented profit incentives to those willing to defy it. When public frustration eventually turned against the violence and corruption associated with bootlegging, the same state that had created those incentives struggled to contain the forces it had helped unleash. For men like D'Aquila, the paradox was clear. The same government that sought to suppress them also kept creating conditions in which their services became more valuable to those willing to ignore or evade official rules. Within the mafia itself, his career falls at a critical juncture between older, more localized forms of organization and the more structured city and nationwide systems that would emerge later. The model often associated with his name, the Capo dei Capi, or boss of bosses, was never a rigidly codified office, but it reflected a real idea that in disputes between families, a senior figure could serve as an arbiter whose word carried special weight. In that sense, his role in the 1910s and early 1920s was as much diplomatic as it was managerial. He had to balance his own family's interests with those of other bosses, trying to prevent local conflicts from spiraling into wars that would attract unwelcome attention. His downfall shows the limits of that model. As prohibition increased the stakes, the informal authority of a single leader became harder to sustain. Younger bosses like Joe Masseria, rising under the new conditions, were less inclined to defer to elders simply because of seniority. The assassination of D'Aquila in 1928, followed by the violent Castellammare War and the eventual creation of the Commission under Lucky Luciano, mark a progression, from attempts at personal monarchy to experiments in collective governance within organized crime. In this arc, his life and death are a hinge between eras, illustrating why later leaders concluded that concentration of symbolic power in one man was as dangerous to their survival as it was advantageous. For the Italian-American communities in which he moved, his existence was both an internal and external burden. Internally, his organization's demands on businesses and workers diverted resources and constrained choices, reinforcing economic hardship and limiting legitimate opportunities. Externally, his activities fed stereotypes that painted entire neighborhoods as breeding grounds for criminality. That stigma shaped how other Americans saw Italian immigrants, influencing everything from hearing decisions to housing policies and law enforcement tactics. The fact that the vast majority of Italian immigrants had nothing to do with organized crime and struggled honestly to build lives did not prevent them from being tarred in some quarters by association with men like him. Confronting that history requires holding two truths at once. On one side is the reality of his agency. He was not simply a passive product of his environment, but someone who made choices to engage in extortion, to build a criminal hierarchy, to enforce his will through coercion and, at times, organized violence. On the other side is the reality of the structural conditions that made those choices viable and, in some eyes, attractive. The limited channels of advancement available to many immigrants, the patterns of discrimination that narrowed legitimate paths to power, and the pre-existing culture of mafia organization that offered an alternative route for those willing to accept its costs. The evolution of law and policing over the decades since his death can also be read as a long, uneven response to the type of system he helped consolidate. Early efforts, focused on individual crimes and spectacular arrests, often left underlying organizations untouched. It was only later, with the development of conspiracy statutes, RICO, and sustained investigative strategies, that authorities began to seriously undermine the continuity that had allowed families like his to survive multiple changes in leadership. Wiretaps, surveillance, and the flipping of insiders gradually pierced the code of silence that had once made men like him seem almost beyond the law's reach. Yet even these later successes did not erase the impact of his era. The habits of deference and fear cultivated under bosses like D'Aquila lingered in some communities long after the most powerful mafia figures were behind bars or in graves. Social and economic patterns shaped in part by decades of underworld influence, such as union corruption or the expectation of off-the-books payments in certain sectors, took time to dismantle. And the very idea of the mafia, fixed in the public imagination by a combination of real history and dramatic storytelling, continued to cast a shadow over Italian-American identity, prompting both creative responses and determined efforts at disassociation. In recent decades, as scholarship on organized crime has broadened and deepened, his story has become one of the threads by which historians trace the larger tapestry of crime and control in industrial societies. Comparisons with other groups, Irish gangs in 19th-century cities, Jewish criminal organizations in the early 20th century, later Latin American drug cartels or Eastern European syndicates, highlight both similarities and differences. In each case, marginalized communities produced individuals who built illicit power structures, exploiting gaps between law and reality. But the specific forms those structures took, and the ways they interfaced with legitimate institutions, depended on local histories and cultures. For the American mafia, and for the Gambino family in particular, the imprint of men like D'Aquila remains evident in the emphasis on hierarchy, secrecy, and territorial control. What distinguishes his legacy from that of more widely known figures is not its magnitude, but its visibility. He was, in many respects, a prototype, an early example of the type of boss whose existence later observers would come to take for granted. The lack of photographs, interviews, or colorful anecdotes about him in popular memory is not evidence of insignificance. It is evidence of how thoroughly he embraced a style of leadership that prized anonymity over spectacle. His influence is easier to see in organizational charts and lineages than in stories told in barrooms or portrayed on screen. Returning in imagination to that unmarked street corner in Manhattan, it is possible to see his life as a thread running beneath the visible history of the city. While mayors came and went, while skyscrapers rose and transit lines were extended, he and those like him operated in the spaces between official systems and everyday survival. Their careers remind us that the story of any great metropolis includes not only the decisions of elected leaders and the efforts of ordinary workers, but also the persistent attempts by some to carve out hidden domains of power in the shadows of legality. For those who study this history today, whether as scholars, law enforcement professionals, or members of communities still grappling with its effects, the value of examining his life lies less in the details of his day-to-day operations, which will never be fully known, and more in what his trajectory reveals about broader dynamics. It shows how organized crime can embed itself in the fabric of a city, feeding on structural inequities and mistrust. It underscores the importance of legal and institutional tools that can address not just isolated offenses, but enduring patterns of coercion. And it cautions against both romanticizing and oversimplifying figures like him, whose actions cannot be cleanly separated from the circumstances that enabled them. Salvatore D'Aquila did not live to see the repeal of Prohibition, the Depression's deepest years, or the Second World War. He did not witness the televised hearings, the high-profile trials, or the eventual partial dismantling of the mafia structures that he had helped mold. By the time his name began to appear in serious histories, his world had already become a matter of record and memory rather than living experience. Yet the arc of his life, from rural Sicily to immigrant New York, from obscure associate to recognized boss, from quiet power to a lonely death on a city street, remains an essential chapter in the longer story of how organized crime took root, adapted, and in many respects began to be undone in the United States. In the end, his significance lies not in any single dramatic episode, but in the cumulative weight of the choices he made and the institutions he shaped. His rise shows how far a determined individual could go within the informal hierarchies of the mafia. His fall shows how precarious even the highest positions could be when rivalries and structural changes converged. The organization that later came to be known as the Gambino family is, in part, his legacy. So too are the lessons drawn from his era by those who have worked in the decades since, to ensure that the kind of unaccountable authority he once wielded finds less room to operate in the cities of today.